Singularity, Lord of Mysteries Chapter 21-40. By Author Shadow_Magus. Vision of the past and present. In his vision, he felt a lot of information being shoved into his mind in almost an instant. He saw Earth, not this Lord of the Mysteries Earth, but rather, he saw the original Earth. He saw a meteor headed towards it. Thankfully, many rockets were fired to its side, and it was deflected away from the Earth. However, just as the meteor passed the Karth, another one came, then another, and another. Max noticed his point of view turning as he noticed the source of the meteors. It was a gigantic mass of flesh with black, red, blue and green tentacles spreading across all of visible space itself. Some of these tentacles were picking up asteroid after asteroid and throwing it at the Earth like it was playing Angry Birds. Max could not see its face, so he did not know if it even had a mouth or eyes, but based on its accuracy, it likely did, or had some other form of detection. Soon enough, the meteors were able to overwhelm Earth's forces and finally made contact, gradually reducing the planet to nothing more than a flaming rock. At this point, the creature stopped in its tracks, as though time itself froze, but the burning and cooling of the surface of the Earth continued, signifying that time had not stopped. A deep, complex and terrifying roar suddenly emanated from the gigantic flesh monster. A roar that would put Ghidorah to shame. The creature began struggling and it rapidly stretched its multicolored tentacles in all directions before retracting it, as though trying to reach out to something, but not knowing where it was. Suddenly, 4 blue spheres floated from the now destroyed Earth, and Max felt a sort of connection to 2 of them, as though he knew them. But he did not get much time to think about it as the creature, who seemed oblivious to the spheres' existences, unknowingly came into contact with the 4 of them. Immediately, it absorbed them, and it gradually calmed down and began retracting its body to become smaller and smaller until finally, Max could see its true form. Most of it looked quite the same as Max's mythical creature form, other than the fact that Max only had black-colored tentacles. Meanwhile, this creature had tentacles of black, red, blue and green, while its eyes were also not the pure black that Max had, but a combination of various different eyes in random places along its body. It looked hideous, no doubt about it. All of a sudden, the creature shattered into 5 parts, and clearly visible in 4 of those 5 parts were the blue spheres that the creature had absorbed just moments ago. Max could feel it, his unknown connection with 2 of them still present, one weaker than the other, but both still present. The 5 parts of the massive creature, though separated, still stayed close together, propelled by an unknown force in a particular direction, so strong that the parts ignored the gravitational forces of the celestial bodies around them as they passed one star system after another. One star cluster after another. One galaxy after another. As they moved across the endless universe, the parts gradually changed. One of them began to condense more and more, pulling the blue sphere into becoming smaller and smaller as well, until it had become dense enough to begin to affect the light that tried to pass around it. Another one began to change into an ever-fluctuating chaotic state of non-existence and existence. The third one just melted with the surrounding nothingness, while also being separated from it on the quantum level. The last one that had a blue sphere remained just a lump of flesh, but it began emitting energy in various forms in all directions. The final piece, and also one that did not have a blue sphere in it, gradually changed shape. It remained made up of flesh, but it no longer had the various colors of the original body and was instead just made up of pure darkness. It slowly formed 2 circles. One of them began to twist into a shape that had 3 corners, but instead of straight lines like a triangle, it was composed of 3 circle arcs, that went from the corner towards the center of the corners, before going to the actual corner. This created a shape similar to that of a flower with 3 petals and a Rouleau's triangle at its center. The second circle became interwoven through the petal shapes, adding a layer of complexity to the otherwise simple shape. After traveling through an uncountable number of galaxies, the parts finally began to slow down. Soon, they entered a new star system, one very similar to the first one seen by Max, whose Earth had been destroyed by the monster who later got split up. This solar system also had an Earth, however, its moon was covered in a thick viscous layer of what could only be described as blood. Max had a vague feeling he knew what was going to happen from here on out, but instead of what he predicted, all 5 parts stopped quite some distance from the Earth. Currently, each part was only the size of 1/10 of the moon, with the larger shape made of 1 petal shape and one interwoven circle being around half the size of the moon. Thus, with the crimson moon blocking the path, nothing and no one from the Earth could actually see the parts of the creature. Without warning, the one part of the creature that did not have a BLUC sphere, and also the largest part, separated from the group of 5 and moved closer to the moon for a few seconds. A thin tentacle of blood extended from the moon and tried to reach towards the petal shape, only to fail to come close to it no matter how much it tried. Many more tentacles extended from the moon trying to wrap around the shape, but were unable to come close to it, or even affect it in any way. The moon then gave up on that and turned to focus on the 4 parts with the blue spheres, but also failed to come close to any of them. After a really long time of a standstill, the shape finally began to move. It began to slowly spin, its gigantic form moving incredibly slowly at first, but gradually speeding up to the point its ends were no longer visible. It began to spit faster and faster until it pulled in the 4 parts into its body before launching them around the moon. The shape itself slowed down and remained in its current spot. More and more tentacles wrapped around it, as though trying to hide it from its original attempt at directly seizing it. Max's vision was pulled towards the 4 parts that were now spinning rapidly around the Earth in a decaying orbit. Soon, they would descend onto Earth, or at least try to, only to be stopped by the barrier placed around it by the true gods. However, Max noticed that the distinct shapes the parts had taken were not becoming smaller and changing forms, turning into yellow spheres, similar to the blue spheres, before merging with the blue spheres. Only now did Max finally get the chance to finally look at some of these blue spheres, and his heart almost stopped. One of them was Samuel's soul and he taken over Max's dead body. Another was a woman in her early teens whom he had never seen before, but he knew that she was likely of Asian origin. But for some reason, the few memories that were visible on her sphere seemed to be of an ancient era where guns and electricity had not been introduced yet. Another blue sphere was of a man whose memories were a complete mess and Max could not make sense of who he was, from where he was, or what time period he had been taken. And the last one, the one that Max did not want to see again in the least, was the blue sphere of someone he knew. It was the memories of someone considerably younger than him, and someone whom he had wronged just to get ahead in life. Though he did not regret doing that much, he still hoped he had left it all in his past life. But as it turned out, his past life had come back to haunt him again. Yes, this blue sphere had the memories of Kai. Max observed as all the blue spheres spun at differing speeds based on the angle at which they reached the Earth, with his own moving the slowest and descending first, slipping past the defensive wall created by the true gods like it was nothing. He had already realized that the 4 parts that split from the main body of the creature were the 4 pathways, and the unity symbol that sent them to this planet was likely Sephiroth to allow him to become unity. Max observed as days and days went by but the other 3 had not descended yet, which made him sigh in relief at the fact that his first month here, that he felt like he had wasted in trying to improve the quality of his body in a safe environment had not given them any advantage. However, he discreetly noticed that he would inevitably end up having to battle against these people in order to see who would ultimately become the true unity above Sequence 0 and ascend to becoming an outer god. Thought, with his significant advantage, he could likely kill them all off before they even became Beyonders and be safe in his pathway without anyone actually actively trying to kill him for his Beyonder characteristics. But that was where the real problem began. Beyonder powers. After his experience of nearly losing control, Max now felt a connection with not just all 3 parts that were spinning around the Earth in a decaying orbit that would sooner or later bring them down to it, but also with the Unity Sephiroth still hiding behind the moon. With these connections, Max would not only be able to know where they had landed, but also which body they had taken over. However, how long this connection would last, what other information he could get, and whether the connection worked both ways was something he did not know. However, Max still had an advantage. He could just go and kill them off as soon as they land on Earth before they get the chance to become a Beyonder. This would nip the problem in the bud, but would also create a new problem. He would never be able to reach the rank of an outer god. As such, he would end up having to leave his fate in the hands of the Great Old Ones and hope they were able to protect Earth and himself along with it. For this, he would have to protect Klein and help him a little, considering how he and the other 3 individuals whose souls were brought here would affect the timeline. However, if he truly wanted to become an outer god, then restricting Klein and preventing him from becoming the Lord of the Mysteries was his best option. After all, he did not have the potion formula or ritual steps for the other pathways. 2 options he had on how to proceed forward, with the first option entailing leaving his entire survival to others, whose chances of success were already almost 0% without the butterfly effects from 4 existences that should not have appeared. If he killed these individuals to save future problems for himself, reduce the changes to the story, and hope Klein advanced, he might lose the possibility of becoming an outer god altogether. And he did not know if the law of indestructibility of Beander characteristics applied to them or not. If it did, then the characteristics might end up in the hands of someone else over time, who he did not know about, and if they somehow got the memories of the pathway and how to advance, it would be very difficult for him to survive. The second option, on the other hand, had an even lower chance of success though. He would have to not just reach sequence 0 in less time than Klein, who had a lot of concealed plot armor, but he also had to help these 4 individuals reach rank 0, then kill them one at a time and assimilate their characteristic in himself to advance to an outer god. Alternatively, Max could try to force them to leak their potion formulas all the way to sequence 0, and make someone he trusts use them to advance, but he could not trust something said by Somcone he was torturing or threatening in any way. Especially if any ingredient was wrong by even a single gram or order you used them in, it would end up in a situation he would much rather not describe. So, he could only allow them to grow normally and reach higher ranks, while also ensuring their safety from other higher beings whose very names were cursed. All this while also growing in strength, influence and capital himself. Taking in a deep breath, Max calmed himself down and sat down on the bed. He glanced outside and noticed that it was still early afternoon and he had a lot of time left for the day to come to an end. However, now that he was a Beander, he needed to be extra careful with each step he took, since being discovered by anyone would mean he would likely be reported up the chains as a Beander, and likely discovered by other much stronger Beyonders. Alright, one can plan about my future in some time. But first, my powers as a Beander, Max thought to himself as he silently stood up and looked around. His powers were rather simple compared to the powers of some of the other pathways. His first and primary power was the ability to attract and repel objects, both living and non-living, from him. Unfortunately, the extent of its effects depends on the weight of the object or person, as well as whether it has Beander powers. How the effects differed was something Max would have to experiment to find out, just like he had to with his Beander sword. Max's second power was the ability to temporarily change the density of non-living objects that he touches directly. How this worked and what were its limits was something he would have to check with experimentation. And that was exactly what he was going to do now. Max stretched out his hand and concentrated on trying to pull the pen on his table. At first, there was nothing, no movement or sound, just unmoving silence. Then the pen trampled ever so slightly, only visible to someone like Max who had almost all his concentration on the item. And then nothing again. Sighing, Max decided to take a break and wipe the sweat that had accumulated on his forehead from the several minutes of stifling concentration. How the hell did Klein perform his divinations and grafting perfectly from the very first attempt? Get it that the information was directly drilled into his mind on how to use the skills, but knowing the exact process, and actually being proficient at it. Max rested for a while, before practicing again. All of a sudden, the pen moved. But it did not move how he wanted it to. Instead, it propelled itself right at Max at an incredible speed. It was so fast, that Max would not have been able to dodge it, the pen going straight through his hand and into his face, killing him on the spot. However, as soon as the pen moved, the entire world suddenly turned black and white, and to Max, it felt almost as though time was running out. However, he also realized that his spirituality was also being spent at an insane speed and he would not be able to keep this up for more than a second. Immediately, Max moved his head, or at least initiated the movement, and by the time the pen had reached him, his head was already out of the way. The pen continued to move along its path and finally landed squarely within a plant of wood. Half its body had gone through the wood. Max pulled out the pen to see that its leaf-shaped tip had been deformed beyond repair. However, this gave him an excellent idea. With this power, he had the perfect assassination tool. All he needed was a metal ball or object of sufficient hardness and light weight to perfectly launch a bullet at his target. "I can fire bullets without a gun," Max exclaimed in delight, only to realize that if someone were looking at him while he did this, they would definitely notice his Beander nature. "So it will be a weapon of last resort," Max thought as he imagined the look of surprise his enemy would have after somehow disarming Max of his weapon, only to have Max pull out completely normal steel balls and blow his brains out. Max then used the same pen that was now unusable and focused his spirituality on it, only to fail terribly in trying to activate his second ability, despite knowing how to use it. Max continued to practice and take breaks all through the evening until it was time for dinner when he went down to the restaurant per bar on the ground floor of his motel. Unfortunately, no meals were considered to be part of his rent, so he had to pay too solely for it. I really need to start getting an income. But first I need to wait for my identification papers from Detective Isengard. Without it, most of the work I wish to do will go to waste. Max could only sigh and return to the practice of his Beyonder powers. Unlike others, he would much prefer it if he could actually use his powers very effectively in combat or otherwise to further increase his chances of survival. June 6, 1348 of the 5th epoch. The next morning, Max spent the early morning after waking up to the not-so-refreshing backland air reading the morning newspaper with a cup of tea, before returning to his practice. Meeting the detective. June 6, 1348 of the 5th epoch. The next morning, Max spent the early morning after waking up to the not-so-refreshing backland air reading the morning newspaper with a cup of tea, before returning to his practice. A few days passed with Max repeating the very same routine continuously, slowly and gradually improving his control over his newly acquired powers. Although it was not at the level of being able to proficiently use it, he was able to still make use of his powers without having to spend minutes on end to concentrate on exactly what he wanted it to do. June 8, 1348 of the 5th epoch. Max finally received a letter from Detective Isengard regarding his request. As it turned out, the old detective with his massive number of contacts in the political, nobility, and Beyonder scenes had allowed him to complete the request incredibly quickly, with a large portion of the time being taken up the postal delivery service of Backland, that was clearly not nearly as good as the modern delivery services. His fake ID had already been prepared by the detective, with only his photograph remaining. For this, the detective had called him to come over on the 10th of June 1348 for it to be taken. He had not exactly stated which of his documents had been prepared, but given the meticulous character of the old man from the novel, Max assumed that he would take care of all the needful. Thus, Max finally decided to stop his daily shut-in lifestyle and head to a particular shop. It was a cutter's shop where suits were made by hand from scratch, as compared to the tailor's shops where the suits were merely tailored to fit the individual. With the former being a task of considerably more experience and skill, it also cost more. However, it ultimately gave a better fitted and design of clothing for the individual. Since this photograph would be an essential part of his future endeavors, and the fact that he would need more of such clothing for his social gatherings, Max went to the cutter's shop. Unfortunately, it took him the rest of the day, as well as 3 whole pounds for his newly made 3-piece suit, that he would not receive until another day passed. Thankfully, this shop did not get a lot of customers compared to normal tailors' shops, so their speed of making his order was pushed up on the priority list and would be completed by the very next day. Returning home after a long day of standing in one place and stretching out different parts of his body, while also trying on what he had initially thought to be a torture device, but turned out to be a more sophisticated measuring device, Max did not spend the day doing much else other than having his dinner, making sure his Beyonder sword was properly sealed, and finally going to sleep. Till now, his days in Backland had been incredibly normal considering the sheer number of Beyonders living in the capital city of the Leon Kingdom, the number of high-sequence individuals in or around the Backland area, and the number of gods who had their eyes on the place most of the time. Plus, compared to Klein's daily chaotic lifestyle of living life on the edge, constantly taking on missions as a detective that somehow led him to one danger after another, Max's peaceful life was something he much preferred. At least he was still weaker than most Beyonders who were higher than Sequence 9. June 10, 1348 of the 5th epoch. Max, who was now wearing a gray double-breasted 3-piece suit with a light blue shirt, a Prussian blue tie, and brown leather shoes, headed out of his motel and towards Detective Isengard. This time, however, he had brought his Beyonder sword with him. He was now a Beyonder, and Detective Isengard would most definitely notice it over the course of their upcoming interaction, if not at first glance. He knew the detective had been kind and helpful to Klein, but he was not the main character of this story and thus did not have plot armor. Thus, it was best to be prepared for the situation where the old man decided to kill him for whatever reason it was possible. Max had learned it the hard way after his originally white 3-piece suit had not only been stained with multiple splotches of soot to the point it could pass for a coat made by a certain female psychopath who liked smoking a pipe with her black and white hair, but his suit had also become an abnormal shade of yellow with time for some reason. Max attributed this to the pollution in the air and in the water used to wash his clothes. Thus, His new suit, which he expected to stay with him for a lot longer, was gray in color to hide any yellow coloring, while also being able to ignore the black spots from the smoke and soot floating through the air like inverted fireflies. Ringing the doorbell, the very same old man Max had seen the first time he came here was in front of him once more. This time, however, Max could feel it. His spirituality was telling him of the danger that the being before him possessed. To a sequence 9 like Max, a sequence 7 like Mr. Eye of Wisdom was indeed like comparing an ant to a frog. One could easily eat the latter in mere moments. However, if enough ants piled up on the frog unless it escaped, it would ultimately succumb. On the other hand, there were existences in this world like kings of angels who were equivalent to lions and tigers that could very easily kill any number of frogs that attacked it. And finally, there were the true gods and outer gods, who were equivalent to dinosaurs of the ancient past of Earth and an uncountable number of meteors waiting to descend on Earth and kill everything. Yup, that very aptly describes the current situation of the world and the apocalypse that would come soon. Max sighed in his mind before smiling at the good detective and waiting for him to allow him to enter. However, the old man simply kept glancing at Max, then towards the strange suitcase he had brought with him, then back to Max. Ahem, I suppose we can discuss my situation inside. Ma pointed out the clear lack of privacy out on the road where anyone could be spying on them without them even noticing. This seemed to bring the detective out of his daze as he gave a smile that did not quite reach his eyes and put his smoking pipe to the other side of his mouth, before gesturing Max to enter as he stood to the side. Max obliged and entered, waiting for the detective to close the door behind him and lead the way to the living room, which was much better decorated than the dull and depressed exterior of the house office of the nearly white-haired detective, who was actually just a middle-aged man, but to Max he felt like an old man. To Samuel, however, he felt like a proper middle-aged man with good hair genetics, but a bad sense of hairstyle. It was a slightly confusing emotion, but ultimately he ignored the feeling and got down to business, loosening the buttons on his suit to better allow him to be seated on the couch of the old detective. "Young lad, do you know what you have done?" he asked, probing whether Max truly knew about Beyonders and voluntarily entered this dark society, or whether he just became one out of luck, was forced to, or was just curious. "Yes, I have become a Beyonder, just like you. Except, I seem to be far weaker than you, and many other strong individuals in Backland apparently," Max said in a calm tone. "Huh," the old detective said, finally taking out a matchbox and lighting his pipe. This was the first time Max was actually seeing the old man lighting his pipe. Welcome to Fanfic Audiobook, your go-to place for immersive audiobooks. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories. Backland and lawyer. After chatting with the detective for a bit, Max had also relaxed considerably. He realized that the old man had a soft spot for children and young adults. Perhaps that was why he had treated Klein so nicely. Either ways, Max realized that the old man had been trying his best to shift Max's attention from trying to become a stronger Beyonder, since Max told him about how it was fully his own choice to become a Beyonder and that he knew exactly what he was getting involved in. Unfortunately, after around an hour of trying, the old man sighed with a hint of resentment and pulled out his pipe, that had long been extinguished due to lack of whatever it was he was smoking, and got up. He brought Max to another room where a white sheet was placed on the wall and a camera was placed on a stand in front of it. Stand in front of the white background. Don't worry, only your head and chest will be visible in the photograph. After having his eyes nearly blinded by the explosive flash, Max and Isengard returned to the living room where Max initiated the discussion after having a glass of water. "So, who am I?" Max asked. "Well, you are Max. Max Verstappen. I did not change your name. But you were adopted by the Black family due to their inability to produce children. The family now consisted of you and your foster parent, Bruce Black and Diana Black. A few years after adopting you, the couple died of old age peacefully, with all their assets being transferred to you. However, you did not wish to continue living in Tingen with their memory still haunting you there, so you sold everything and came to Backland to start anew under the name of Max Verstappen. How much money do you have?" Max's eyebrow twitched at the name of his parents in the background created by the old man, a detail that was picked up by the detective, who just assumed Max did not wish to disclose the details about his financial situation. "Somewhere between £500 and £5,000. That is quite the sum. Are you sure you got this money legally? Otherwise, I will have to create a new background for you." My old man was peacefully living his life, so I can only assume he got it legally. Else the government officials would have already arrested him. Max shrugged. He knew that it was incredibly hard for individuals to backtrack physical money, even more so in this era of steam and machinery. Of course, there was the odd chance that Beyonders would be able to do so, but by the time the official Beyonders tried to investigate him, he should have earned enough money to control some things within the political circle of Backland and help him escape such things. Anyways, here is your payment. Detective Isengard. Max said while pulling out a few £1 notes and handing them to the detective. Oh yes, detective, do you perhaps know of a lawyer I could hire to help me come up with a contract? Detective Isengard accepted the payment and asked, what kind of contract? Well, I intend on purchasing a part of a shop and turning it into a chain of shops all over Backland. I need something legal such that I can later sell it to someone who is much more ambitious and capable to take over and handle the business. A legal document for an investment, huh? I know a guy. He said, taking out a yellow piece of paper and writing down a name and an address. He should be available today, but if you want, he should be available after 2 days as well. Though I am not too sure about it since the last time I had a chat with him was a fortnight ago, and his schedule may have changed. Thank you. Max bowed his head slightly, but then looked back at the old man. Do you know of a way I can hide the fact that I am a Beyonder from others? Especially the official Beyonders. This time, the old man remained silent for quite some time. He then shook his head. I am sorry, but I do not possess such items or abilities. However, as long as you do not use your abilities in front of other Beyonders, as long as they are not too high of a sequence, they should not be able to determine if you are truly a Beyonder or not. Even for me, I only realized you were a Beyonder because of the sword of yours. Young lad, you'd be better off disposing of it as soon as you can, since any Beyonder, even at sequence 9, can recognize it as a Beyonder artifact. What kind is not easily determined, but it affects the spirituality around it to the point everyone who sees it in close proximity will know that it is a Beyonder item. Alright, thank you either way. Max nodded and finally stood up. I will be heading straight to your lawyer friend and try and work things out with him before renting a house in the Hillston borough. I will mail you the address once I settle down, and you can send over my documents to the address. Though, do you have a better form of communication? A more secure kind? Max asked while turning around as he put on his gray double-breasted jacket. Max, how many times do I have to tell you that you are better off not getting involved in this world? Too late, detective. I'm already involved. Can't go back now. Anyways, you didn't answer my question. No, I do not. I also suggest you do not get a messenger since the spirit world is a place where the stronger Beyonders keep a close eye on it. If you want to survive, I suggest you stick to normal communication. And what would happen if, say, I were to have to escape Backland for some reason? What then? How would I communicate with you? Wait for months on end for you to receive a letter by mail, with the odd chance of it being misplaced along the way or damaged. Okay, how about this? I will give you the ritual to call my messenger, but you can only make use of it in either an emergency or when you are not in Backland. Thanks, Max said, lowering his head once again. Isengard had also helped him a lot. The money he had paid him was more of just a gesture, and Max also knew it. Creating a proper identity from scratch did not just include bribing a few officials, but involved using your connections at a much higher level in the hierarchy to push things along and fabricate things out of nothing. It would have cost a whole lot more than just a few pounds, and Max knew it. It seems as though I have a thing for ending up being helped by old or aging people. Max thought to himself before bidding the old man farewell. Leaving Detective Isengard's house, Max headed straight for the lawyer's office. Or at least that was where he thought he was going until the address led him straight to a home, similar to the aging detective's own. And just like the detective, the lawyer also had his office and house in the same house, combined into one for convenience and comfort, though it made one seem less professional. Thus, this person was either an incredible amateur at being a lawyer, or a highly decorated one whose name alone should bring enough weight with it. Considering that Detective Isengard Stanton had recommended him, Max assumed it was the latter and prepared himself. The person who opened the door was an incredibly young man, perhaps 15 or 16 years old. He was wearing a pair of silver-rimmed glasses which seemed a tad bit too large for his slender and childlike face that was unblemished with facial hair. His silver eyes looked at Max with an almost impossible amount of curiosity and naivety. Yes, he asked in a slightly childlike voice. Do you perhaps know a Mr. Eckhart? I was sent here to meet him. That would be me. ISCE, could you please tell him that? Ahem, I am sorry for that. My name is Max Verstappen. I was sent here by a referral from Detective Isengard. Max said with an apologetic smile on his face, trying his best to hide his confusion at the odd situation. Suddenly, the situation became even worse than before. Ritual. All of a sudden a frail and wrinkled hand reached out from behind Mr. Eckhart and smacked him on the head as though trying to swat away a fly. Doing you or what, Brenda? Driving away another customer. Take my place after my retirement you will, now not though. And belongs to me this. The hand pulled off the silver-rimmed spectacles off the young man, whose name seemed to be of a woman. Behind the fake Mr. Eckhart, who was now assumed to be Brenda, a lean and hunched figure came out, and put on the spectacles that seemed to fit him perfectly. He had a face that was disgusting and reminded him of a certain magical castle caretaker with a pet cat. Thankfully, unlike the original, this person did had some hair on his head, and did not grow the sides out, keeping a rather normal hairstyle with the hair slicked back using some kind of hardening gel or just plain old wax. Yup, seems like a sleazy lawyer to me. Max nodded internally as he put on his professional smile, ignoring the mishap with Brenda, and began to speak. Good morning, I am. It is morning no longer, child. Well, good day regardless. I am Max Verstappen, and I came here looking for Mr. Eckhart. Mr. Isengard sent me this since I was looking for a lawyer to help me make a deal, as well as perhaps talk about future endeavors as well. New customer you are. The coffee get, Brenda. Max's lip trembled slightly at the blatant copyright display that would have had a certain mouse company thrashing him with lawsuits every second, but suppressed his emotions and went inside with the old lawyer. Max left the house with a smile on his face while looking at the hazy but still visible sunset in the distance. Today was productive, Max thought to himself as he buttoned his gray suit and began making his way to a nearby hotel. He would search for a house in a few days. But tonight, he had more pressing matters to attend to. In his newly rented hotel room, Max took out a few candles as well as some chalk. Using the chalk, Max drew a circle with a few oddly shaped words on it. From what he assumed, this was something similar to ancient Hermes, but not quite. Though, Max did not actually know ancient Hermes, and he would need someone to teach him the language in order to be able to survive in this world. But that was not important. After the symbols, Max placed each of the candles in certain spots along the circle and lit each of them one at a time before leaving the last one empty. He then began to make strange sounds that reminded him of many tongue twisters from back on Earth. Ancient Hermes, unlike ancient Fasak that Max knew, was a very old language dating its origin back to the Second Epic. And, unlike ancient Fasak, ancient Hermes had actual effects on the mystical world and was used in countless rituals and even Beyonder abilities. Max did not know exactly what he was saying, but he had a rough estimate. Less than Mother Goddess of Depravity, less than P greater than. Origin of Evil, the Indestructible greater than, along with some other words after the end. However, based on the vision he had seen while losing control a few days ago, Max was sure about one thing. The outer god and X-pillar that he had seen in his dream back in Tingen was supporting him. Or at the very least helping him to become stronger for her to use in the future. Most likely to try and take over his Unity Sephiroth that was hiding behind her, in a similar fashion to what Mr. Air had tried to do with Klein. So, I will just make use of her more than she would ever be able to make use of me. Max had decided not long after he had the vision of his origin and the impending problems he would face. At first, Max was hesitant to use the ritual given to him by the Crimson Moon, since anything could have happened. Plus, he did not have the spirituality to actually complete the mission. Now, not only did he have the spirituality, but he also had a reason to not only trust the Crimson Moon but also to speed up his initial plans to slowly accumulate enough power to advance sequences. Thus, the ritual. The last candy had not been lit, and as Max began to speak the incredibly convoluted tongue twister, he felt his spirituality gradually leave his body and collect near the tip of the candle at the center of the circle. The Crimson Moon's brightness began to increase slowly, from its normal red diffusion to a slight crimson radiance, to finally becoming a bloody beam of light, spreading all over Backland without actually focusing on a single location. However, it only lasted an instant before returning to normal. Most would only consider this an incident where their eyes were playing a joke on them. Some would be more perceptive but still assume it was just a freak accident. Only a select few high-sequence Beyonders, as well as certain sequence 0 existences, knew what this was, and what it meant. All of a sudden, many of the churches in Backland and the secret Beander hideouts of the other churches in Backland who could not officially exist there received direct orders to search for anything and everything odd going on in Backyund. It was at the moment that the red light had reached back, that the centermost yellow candle on Max's circle lit up, but instead of fire, it was lit up with glowing blood. Quite literally glowing blood that was shaped in the form of a flame. The blood drop grew rapidly until it became the size of a fist in just a single moment before bursting and evaporating into nothingness, just as soon as the red light all over Backland had stopped. Clack! Max noticed a small mottled bronze key falling to the ground. It had various engravings on it with deep circles joined by much shallower lines, forming around 7 constellations which were unknown to Max. However, one of them he did know, and it was the symbol of the Intis Republic's ex-royal family, the Sauron family who was overthrown by the previous reincarnator Emperor Russell. Klein quite liked this one who was his predecessor since they were both Chinese, and he had written most of his life experiences in Chinese that Klein used to understand lots of the world around him, as well as give subtle hints about future plot points. Anyway, Max did not spend too much time on the key and just threw it in his pocket before quickly putting out all the other candles and cleaning the ground, ensuring no candle wax or marks were left on the wood floor. After everything was done, Max sighed and sat down on his stiff bed with a smile on his face. Everything had worked out well, and he could finally take a look at his item. Max pulled out the bronze key and observed it, recalling his memories from when the Crimson Moon had visited his dream and told him about the ritual and the item it would give. Sequence 3. Wanderer. Item and eventful day. Sequence 3. Wanderer partial Beander characteristic. Wanderer is the sequence 3 of the door pathway, has many abilities that allow to pass obstacles. Beyonders of this pathway can travel and teleport, perform divination, phase through objects, evade with tricky spells, record and use other Beyonders' powers. The Wanderer's main ability is that he or she is no longer trapped by the spirit world, enabling them to enter the cosmos, and wander through the astral world, heading to different planets, and encountering different civilizations. This Beander characteristic has been split from other aspects of itself, resulting in a single item with the ability to open portals between locations when used in the keyhole of doors. Although it is not limited by the spirit world, it does not possess any other abilities of the Wanderer characteristic. This characteristic has also been heavily corrupted and thus will never bring you to where you actually wanted to go. It will randomly send you to any door. However, if you use the key on the same door that it was used on earlier, it will lead you to the exact same door as it was connected to before, since there has been a connection formed between the two doors. In the case one of the doors has been destroyed or is unable to open or accept a key, the connection will be destroyed, but the door you have used the characteristic on will be permanently unable to connect to any other door. So, an emergency random teleportation device, but with the restriction of being only used on doors with a keyhole, and once the connection is made, the same door will never lead to another location. Well, this might be useful in a lot of cases, but I better experiment with it a bit more, Max thought to himself while putting the key away in his pocket, and buttoning up the pocket to prevent it from falling out. This will be useful. Max smiled as he thought of all the situation where he would just escape from pursuers and never be heard from again. Imagine running from a mobster, sliding across the cold and slightly slippery floor from the rain in the evening, as the crimson moon high up in the sky beams down its dull redness. All of a sudden, you take a turn and enter an alley, the 4 men following almost right behind you also make the turn and see you opening a door leading into one of the bars on the street and entering it, closing the door behind you. Not waiting for anything, the men burst through the door with brute force, only to see a completely dark room. They spend hours searching every corner of the room and still fail to find you. On the other hand, you are on the other side of the kingdom, or even the world, just relaxing your muscles from the chase. Max's smile grew even more hideous as he then thought of all the things he could do to illegally earn money. But then the official Beyonders would get involved, so Max put those thoughts away and decided to head off to sleep for the night. It had been quite the eventful day. Not only had he met Mr. Eckhart the lawyer and spoke to him about what he intended to do in Backland, but he also got him to form up a contract for investment in a department store. Max did not need to have his identification papers with him while he was making the papers, and he was sure that the good detective would finish up his papers soon and hand them over to him. Other than the contract with the department store, which gave him quite a bit of control, Max also had the lawyer draw up some other investment papers involving just Max owning a portion of the company in exchange for his investment. When his investment was repaid with a blank amount of interest, he would return the ownership of the company to the entrepreneur. Max also discussed the issue of legal advice with the old and frail-looking lawyer, who said that he was welcome to come to the office for legal advice, but he would be unable to be hired parentally by Max due to his own health problems. This situation was also acceptable to Max, but if his ventures were indeed successful, he would have to come up with a better and long-term solution that did not involve him wasting a few hours for a single consultation on the legalities of a particular business decision. Still, for now, it worked, so Max had returned to his hotel and had performed the ritual, before heading off to bed after seeing and understanding the basics of his newly acquired item. June 10, 1348 of the 5th epoch. Max quickly got out of bed and got ready. He was wearing normal clothes, not his considerably expensive gray suit. He took all his luggage with him and left the model, the Wanderer's key still in his button pocket, safely. The mornings in Backland, like most of the day, were dull and filled with a greenish-brown haze in the air. Still, it did not mitigate his enthusiasm for the day, which was going to be quite the eventful one. As it had turned out, the good detective had somehow managed to complete the entire process of finalizing his identity, got the necessary papers in order, and had them all delivered to him by the time he woke up and was getting ready to leave the motel to rent a more decent and much more private house for himself like Klein had done in the main storyline when he had left Tingen and gone to Backland. With the new identification, however, Max was naturally looking for something a lot more stable, as well as something more suited to his persona as the heir to a moderately rich family, comfortably seated somewhere between upper middle class and upper class. However, another consideration came to Max's mind as he was heading to the housing society in charge of helping people find their ideal homes, which was the future plot. Originally, Klein reincarnated in June 1349, and in around September 1349, he arrives at Backland following his own death in Tingen. In around December of 1349, a super conspiracy takes place and a smog that nearly kills a quarter of Backland arrives. This would naturally cause the prices of real estate to nosedive very rapidly over a very short period of time, not only due to the large fall in the actual number of people in Backland, thus causing a fall in demand, but also due to the fall in the confidence of the common folk in their current rulers and the stability of the city itself. Thus, just purchasing a house just a year before the prices were going to plummet would not be a very financially sound decision. Ultimately, Max ended up renting a gardened house in a high-end street of the Hillston borough called Truffle Street. This was a place moderately near the financial center of Hillston borough, where all the large banks and stock exchanges had their headquarters, and sufficiently far from any official Beander hideouts that he knew of. Max spent £150 to rent it out for the whole year and not be bothered by the landlord for that period of time. He had also gladly shown his newly acquired identification and finally found a safe space for himself. While he was settling in, Max suddenly recalled something as he put away his 2 sets of clothes into the wardrobe. He recalled the luck enhancement ritual that Klein had initially thought had brought him to this world, and how it helped him more easily connect to his Sephiroth, the Sephira Castle. What if I am also connected to the Unity Sephiroth? What if all 4 of us are connected to it, or only the first one to transmigrate? Or what if it is only the last one? What if a ritual could help me connect to the Unity Sephiroth and gain some super broken powers like the suppression ability to suppress the powers of other Beyonders and Beyander items that were taken to the Sephiroth? Maybe it could help me gain a distinct advantage over the other 4. Max thought to himself as he continued to unpack his stuff and place it in different places all over the house, especially for the money, which was slowly placed in various different parts of the house, including under the wooden planks, inside the mattress of the bed, and even in hidden compartments of the drawers that were constantly there from before. However, in the last spots, Max only put a since pence, along with a note saying, "I know you were in my house. I may not know who you are, but I will find you. And I will kill you," followed by a smiley face. After thinking about it for a while, Max finally decided to try out Klein's luck enhancement ritual, but instead of using the Lord of Mysteries, honorific name, reciting which might bring about a greater disaster upon himself than even calling out the true names of certain gods, Max decided to try and make up an honorific name for himself. But then recalled something about the original plot that was related to Klein's luck enhancement ritual. Something he did not think about for too long and instead focused on coming up with a name for Unity, the being of multicolored tentacles. After a few hours of racing his brains for the chant, trying to target the remaining will of unity with the Sephiroth behind the moon, without unknowingly calling along some other eldritch horror instead, Max finally came up with something he felt was decent. However, he did not say it out loud and instead said it in his mind, hoping that was enough. The primordial unity for blessings. The progenitor of singularity and decay for blessings. The everlasting spectrum and paradox for blessings. The universal amalgamation of all for blessings. This was a very crude combination of all the various pathways that together made up unity as he had seen in the vision. And putting them together, it most definitely did not point to another extremely dangerous being, hopefully. Max sucked in a deep breath and held it, keeping his eyes open in case something happened. However, nothing happened. A second passed in silence. A minute passed in silence. 3 minutes passed in silence. Nothing happened. Max let out the breath he had held and looked around once more to make sure he was not dreaming or something. Ha ha, I must be that the Sephiroth is in some sort of sleep mode and will likely only be accessible by me or the other 3 reincarnators when we either accomplish certain conditions like becoming a true god, or a certain time has elapsed. Max chuckled internally as he let go of the tight bundles of anticipation and fear he had built up in his mind since the thought of connecting to the Unity Sephiroth came to mind. Just to be doubly sure, he reached out his hand and repelled the one solely he had been holding in his hand. However, once again, nothing happened. Max repeated his attempts at using his Beyonder powers and failed multiple times. 1 attempt, failed. 2 attempts, failed. 5 attempts, failed. Max was already sweating in his mind, thinking about the various possibilities. The first thing that came to mind was that he was in a dream or illusion created by a Beyonder, like the nightmares of the Nighthawks belonging to the Church of the Evernight Goddess. But that was quickly ruled out as he finally felt something different from normal. Hope to survive. Max could faintly hear it. It was as soft of a baby's whisper while sleeping, and as distant as the sun from the earth. It felt strangely calming to Max. But as the seconds passed, it gradually became louder, and was also no longer originating from a distant single source, but from all around him. The noise gradually turned from barely audible whispers to full-blown ravings. Still, Max could not make out what it was saying, but he assumed it was either in ancient Hermes or one of the other mystical languages. Still, it kept getting louder and louder until it began to actually cause Max harm as he felt his mind begin to pound along with the unnatural rhythm of the ravings. Soon enough, Max fell to his knees as his mind felt like it was being ripped apart from the inside, but since there was not enough space in his skull, it was being held together, only for it to press furiously against his skull in all directions, resulting in his brain being slowly squished into paste. Only now did Max recall something. It was the fact that behind the scenes of Klein's revival, most of the true gods had worked together with Evernight Goddess to dispose of the full pathway characteristics that were infected by a certain someone, while also preventing his descent onto Klein's body. And all of this was because his consciousness was within the Sephiroth. Then what about the consciousness of unity? Would it also not be within the Sephiroth? Was the last thought Max could think of before he lost consciousness and his vision blacked out completely. This stopped the pain in his head but also stopped his thinking, resulting in him only feeling the moment he lost consciousness, and only recovering his thinking when he woke up. Ugh, why didn't I think about the consequences of attempting to come into contact with a Sephiroth? Why didn't I take into account other possibilities? Max thought to himself with a groan as he recovered his senses and looked around. Unfortunately, there was nothing around him other than complete and utter darkness. Looking down to try and search the floor, Max realized that there was someone behind him, and turning around, he noticed that it was none other than Samuel, whose memories he had received after he was killed back on Earth. Samuel was also looking at him with the same strange expression as he was looking at him. In a sense, the two were dead men, fused into one by a chaotic scries of unforeseen events, revived by the effect of the combination, and thrust back into this unforgiving world. The two were one, despite being separated, and their emotions were naturally shared, causing both to burst into laughter simultaneously upon realizing what they felt towards the other. However, at this moment, the two felt a kind of pressure they had not felt before. It caused them both to become silent as their backs became straight as a rod from the natural response to something frightening. Max and Samuel looked around the empty void but found nothing. Then, the two gradually saw black, blue, green and red colors descending from various directions, converging to their locations. *T where am I? Max thought to himself as Samuel also thought the same thought at the same time. Soon, the two realized that the lights were actually eyes, and immediately the two recalled the vision they had had when they actively tried to lose control slightly to observe the changes it brought in his mythical beast form. These were very distinctly the eyes of the hideous unity in its full form before it was split into the 4 pathways in its Sephiroth. Oh no, we need to get out of here. And fast, Max cursed in his mind, a similar thought running through Samuel's mind. Except, he was analyzing the current situation from a more analytical point of view. Although the two were already one, in this place, for some reason, the two could have their own separate thoughts. Should I call out to him? Max thought to himself as the idea entered his mind, before being thrown back into the trash. Doing this was essentially a nuclear bomb, where both parties involved would end up losing everything, and was only to be used if he had something he could offer that was more important than his own body. Escape, Max thought to himself, but then Samuel's thoughts entered his mind. To where? Samuel threw his own thoughts into Max's mind unceremoniously. Back to our body, Max rebutted, hoping there was a way out. But he felt the seriousness of Samuel and understood that this hope of his was futile. If I am not wrong, we are in your body, in your soul most likely. That would be the only reason why I can exist as a separate being. Anywhere else the two of us would still be one, fused perfectly together, and then perfectly with your body. Samuel said calmly, though his emotions were not as calm and Max could feel it. In fact, Max was also feeling this same emotion. Along with tiny hints of disgust and awe, the main emotion the two were feeling was fear. Yes, fear, a primal fear originating from their very beings, from their very cores as living creatures. The unity in front of them was not something they would be able to fight. At least not as a Sequence 9 Beander. Perhaps, when Max became a true god, at Sequence 0, maybe it might be possible. But for now, it was impossible. The eyes were swiftly moving closer and closer together, and as they converged, Max could feel his senses screaming at him to do something. Move, change, escape, do something. Max and Samuel could feel their spirituality screaming at them to figure out a way to escape quickly. But they essentially only had 3 options. Operation nuke them all and allow him to sneak his way into our pathway. Maybe even killing us in the process. Max thought while Samuel spoke out next in their mind connection. Operation corruption guaranteed, and ask Mother Goddess of Depravity to help us. But she would also likely corrupt our pathway since it is evident she wants the Sephiroth of Unity that is literally within her reach, but she is unable to touch it because she does not have its pathway. That was also likely the reason she had helped them so far. Operation Last Stand. Fight the will of Unity until something changes. The third option was likely to end up in 3 results. Either Max and Samuel won and took control over the Sephiroth, the will of Unity won and took over their body, neither of the two won and everyone either fell dormant or took collective control over the Sephiroth in Max's body. Despite being an outer god, and an ex-pillar at the level of a great old one, Max still preferred dealing with Mother Goddess of Depravity over him from Operation Nuke Them All. However, the Last Stand operation had only one outcome where they lost everything, considering it was only the will of Unity and not an actual alive outer god. All they needed to do was either win, which was unlikely, or draw with the will of Unity, which was far more likely. Thus, after a quick back and forth within just a few seconds, the two souls took the risk of fighting it out with the will instead of getting an outside party involved in this mess. After all, they knew the situation Klein had fallen into when he had intervened in his ascension and almost took control of the Sephiroth. With a screous expression, Max and Samuel reached out to Cash Other, and grasped Cash Other's hands tightly, before turning into light and merging together, ultimately forming a slightly older Max, but his overall size had actually more than doubled. Still, in comparison to the Colossus, they were nothing more than an ant. An ant preparing to face off against something that can only be considered the entire solar system. A single person preparing to face off against an unstoppable force. A lone figure, hoping to survive. Universal amalgamation of all. June 11, 1348 of the 5th epoch. Max exited his newly bought house the next morning with an odd smile on his face. While walking, he stopped oddly for an instant, before resuming his walking. Every movement he made had this unnatural pause in it, as though he was a puppet whose controller could not smoothly make his body move. Looking up at the sun whose blaring intensity had been mitigated by the dense fog around Backland, Max recalled the events of last night, and the utterly baffling incidents that happened to himself. The fusion of Max and Samuel stood bravely in front of the creature of nightmares, as the eye's various multicolored and shaped eyes converged at their location. However, unlike what they had expected, the being did not immediately launch attacks at them to try and eliminate them completely, and take over their body just like a certain someone had done after Klein had used his help to defeat a monocled someone. Instead, it stretched out a single tentacle towards Max, one that looked incredibly frail and was slightly quivering as it moved through the space between Max and the being, as though a Hulk was trying to delicately pass a human mouse-sized thread through a needle. Max was prepared to back away at any moment, but the multicolored tentacles approached him slowly and touched his hand as delicately and softly as possible. And that was the end of that. Max felt his brain explode and his vision blacked out. The next thing he remembered was waking back up in his body. However, this time, he felt three things different from him. Firstly, he felt a connection with the Sephiroth hiding behind the moon, a stable connection at that. Secondly, he felt vast amounts of knowledge about the Sephiroth, his current situation and the situation with the other three currently orbiting the Earth. And thirdly, Max felt a third presence within his soul. Max's soul was no longer just Max, Samuel and the memories of the pathway, but now also included another being's memories, Unity. And Unity's soul was incredibly haphazardly fused with Max's and Samuel's own perfectly fused soul. It felt like if enough power was involved, it would actually be possible to split Unity from Max. Though the memories of Unity were very insightful as to its origins compared to the origins of the other outer gods and pillars, all of whom originated from a super powerful being that created everything. Unity, on the other hand, originated from no one. When the one that created everything did so, a force was born as a result of the creation process. A force that not only governed the existence of everything but also acted on bringing it all together to reform the state of nothingness. The force was immediately recognized by the creator, who immediately disposed of it using all his power by condensing it into a single point and flinging that point outside his domain of creation, to affect nothing in the deepest parts of the void where none of his creations existed. Unknown to him, the condensed force continued to condense, since it was the embodiment of fusing back together until it created a being strong enough to carry out its job of unifying everything and return it to nothingness. Thus, Unity was born, and the very first thing it did was use the rocks around it to destroy a planet it came across while being flung through space. However, in this process, remnants of the now nearly split-up creator sensed the birth of Unity and sent some of his power to ensnare souls from the destroyed planet and use the souls of fully developed humans to overpower the newborn soul of Unity and split it before it fully matured and destroyed his creation. However, this caused the now split Unity to have a sense of direction to head towards. An instinctual urge to return its home to nothingness caused it to begin moving towards his creations that existed in a space of void. And that was where the vision Max had seen when he tried to lose control continued until he was sent to this new Earth. The process of traveling from the location of the destroyed Earth that existed outside his creation to this new cosmos where all his creations existed, had caused almost 5 epochs to pass. And that was the origin of Unity. This origin story also allowed him to understand why exactly the soul of the split Unity within the Sephiroth was so small compared to his own, which was essentially 1.5 fully matured human souls. Unity had just been created and was further split into 5 parts, with each of them containing a portion of its understanding of the pathways it contained, thus resulting in a shriveled husk of the former Unity's soul, with nothing but the briefest of memories of its existence, and the understanding of the Sephiroth it occupied. And this understanding of the Sephiroth was not with Max as well. The Sephiroth was called universal amalgamation of all, and it had an effect on Max's thought process just before he reached out to Unity. It had given him subconscious hints as to its name as well as Unity's name, to get him to call out to them and allow either him to win over Unity or the other way around. Either way, it would allow the universal amalgamation of all to finally fuse with the other pathways and possibly become whole again. This was also why he had not thought about the consequences of calling out to Unity, as it had transformed his greed for power and knowledge into something that blinded him from the consequences of his own actions. Now everything made sense. But what were the uses of the Sephiroth? Well, there were many. Firstly, Max could use the aura of the Sephiroth to purge most kinds of corruption from objects. But just like Klein using the Saphira Castle to purge the contamination from fallen gods, it was possible for the ones whose corruption he was removing to know that someone had removed it from the object. Thus, trying to clean the Wanderer's key he had received from the Mother Goddess of Depravity was out of the question for the time being. Secondly, ordinary objects placed within the Sephiroth would also slowly turn into sealed artifacts. Though the speed was ridiculously slow compared to the Sephira castle, perhaps due to the fact that the latter was receiving a constant supply of prayers from a sealed part of the world, or because the former was too new of a Sephiroth in terms of being used by Beyonders or given prayers to be able to quickly turn objects into scaled artifacts. Thirdly, anything kept within the Sephiroth would be contaminated by the aura of the universal amalgamation of all. This was not an ability but instead a downside, as it would expose his connection with the Sephiroth if someone like the Mother Goddess of Depravity saw such objects. Fourthly, any powers Max used from within the Sephiroth will be amplified by quite a bit, but not enough to actually affect any high-sequence Beyonders, or even mid-sequence Beyonders at the moment. Another ability was the fact that the Sephiroth shielded Max from any prying CYCS as well as physical harm from any beings, even outer gods. However, this protection was only for things inside the S-Sephiroth, and at the moment, the only thing that could enter was his soul and not his physical body. Lastly, and the most important ability Max could think of was the ability to use the abilities of one sequence ahead of his own pathway. This meant that he could use the abilities of Fool's End within the Sephiroth. But Max could try that later since it was already morning by the time he had regained consciousness, and it had already taken him really long to process all this information. Other than these abilities, Max also got a certain piece of news that sent shivers up his spine. All this time, he had been thinking about certain super-powered beings, and just by even knowing their names, they already knew about you. And he had been casually calling out names like Adam, Mother Goddess of Depravity, Evernight Goddess, Ins Zangwil, a certain psychopathic Quill, and many more without thinking about how they would react upon knowing about a certain sequence 9 Beyonder from an outer god pathway knowing so much about them. Thankfully, the Sephiroth had been using its powers to alter the very reality and prevent these beings from knowing about Max's thoughts. Apparently, it had stopped most of the strong beings from knowing about Max and his thoughts but had overlooked the Quill, who had almost given his identity to the betrayer of Evernight, only to be stopped by the combined efforts of the Mother Goddess of Depravity and the universal amalgamation of all. Since they were directly influencing a Grade 0 sealed artifact that was hidden behind the barrier protecting the Earth, it had taken both their efforts to stop this from happening. After all, shielding Max's mind to prevent his thoughts from escaping, and physically stopping and erasing the memories of a Grade 0 sealed artifact were very different things. From this moment forth, Max had also decided to stop thinking about these supreme beings so casually and only do it once his soul was within the Sephiroth, just for precaution to prevent something like the Quill giving away his information to others from happening again. Dunant's department store. Having his soul become a Frankenstein of two perfectly fused souls, and another much weaker and smaller soul just haphazardly stitched to the previously perfect fusion was not very comfortable. Now, the imbalance in his soul caused the control over his body and facial expressions to weaken every now and then, at random. Though Max understood that the bite-sized soul of Unity would gradually merge with his own, just like Samuel's had, at the moment, it did hinder his movements randomly. It was not consistently making him lose control over his body, but rather similar to a pulse of uncontrollable body movement or jerking motion before everything returned back to normal. Max first took his carriage towards Mr. Eckhart's home office, and collected the 2 sets of contracts he had had the experienced lawyer make for him, leaving the names and some details blank for Max to fill in based on the situation and result of negotiations. Then, he took a carriage and headed towards Dunant's department store. He had the 2 contracts in hand, based on how the current owners of the store wanted to interact with him, as a financial investor only, or a partner equal to them. On the way, Max had indeed noticed that the fog of Backland was indeed slowly becoming thicker and thicker, most likely due to the actions of a certain someone who wanted human slaves. Max was also now making a conscious effort not to take or even think of the names of all powerful beings who were above Sequence 6, just to be safe. The single horse carriage that could only fit 2 individuals soon arrived at the location he had wanted to go, and after paying the driver, Max alighted the carriage and entered the store. "Is the owner here?" Max said with a polite smile, his face twitching halfway through before returning to normal and completing the action. He was once again wearing his double-breasted gray suit to give off the vibes of a rich person. How may I help you, mister?" A middle-aged woman wearing considerably normal clothes under her slightly worn-out white apron came through the curtain which separated the area behind the counter from a backroom of some sort. This middle-aged lady had blonde hair which had been tied in a bun, and a considerable amount of dirt layered over it. Only some slits between the hair strands revealed the true blonde color of her hair. She had a thin and frail body, with an innocent face but a fire behind her eyes. The young lady who was handling the cashier nodded slightly to the newly arrived lady before heading away. "Hello, madam, I am Max Verstappen. I was looking to invest in your shop. Do you have somewhere we can go to discuss the details, somewhere more private?" Max said with his most businessman-like smile. "Oh, of course. Please follow me," she said, snapping out of her shock incredibly quickly and opening the counter for Max to follow her to the back room of the store. Along the way, his steps halted, but only for an instant before returning to normal and allowing Max to follow her through. Max followed her and passed through the curtain that separated the two locations, realizing it was a simple white cotton curtain which had been slowly blemished with dirt and other things until it reached its current grayish-brown color. Inside, Max found an odd scene. There were around 5 others, all young and filled with vitality for the day to come, quickly eating their breakfast. Clearly, they were either the owner's children who worked here or workers hired by her to manage the store, since Max recalled one of them being the salesman who had helped him with the items he wanted to purchase the first time he had come here. After the owner lady shooed away all of them from the room to go and cat somewhere else, Max and the lady sat down to discuss business, with the hint of freshly baked bread still lingering in the air of the windowless room. "So, madam, oh my, where are my manners? My name is Victoria Dunnant, you can just call me Ms. Dunnant. Ms. Dunnant, before we begin anything, were those young men and women your children or were they workers you hired?" "Oh, well, they are all workers I had initially hired for the shop, but ended up adopting them since they had nowhere else to go." "I see, but in theory, would you be able to handle expanding the business? Like more shops similar to this one, and many, many more workers? Would you be able to handle it? Perhaps. I have not actually done it yet, so I do not have a clue. But I can try," she said, with an eager expression. Max nodded to her answer, thankful she was not someone who would try to lie to others for her own gain, no matter how short-term that may be. "Another question. I am sorry if I come off as rude, but I would need the answers to my questions before making the decision to invest. And after everything, you also have the option to refuse the investment, with no bad blood between us. What about your husband? And what about your blood family? How is this related to investing in the store? Again, I am sorry if these questions have made you uncomfortable, but your mental health is important to an investor. And a major part of this is your relationships including spouse and family." -1 second. "Well, my husband left this world a few years ago, leaving behind nothing but this single store. As for my family, they are actually doing very well. Thanks to this store, they are all living comfortable lives right here in Backland." "Thank you. Another question I have, is how much of the store's earnings are being sent to this family of yours?" This was an important question, since the condition of the shop may be fine, but the clothes worn by everyone here meant that they were either not getting enough money to keep their clothes clean or buy new ones, or that they were cost-cutting to an extreme. But considering the absolute luxury this so-called relative of the owner of this shop he had met on the train was living, the former was very likely. "Well, I sent everything except for what is needed to purchase the items sold or new items, and to keep me and my children fed." "I see. How much of the department store do you actually own?" "Ms. Dunnant, well, on paper, how much of the business do you actually own? And does the business own this store or is it owned by someone? Also, what about supply? Where do you get your items from, and how?" Ms. Dunnant stopped for a moment. She then stood up and went to a drawer, pulling out a piece of paper which had the Leon Kingdom's symbol on it, signifying it was an official document. "Sign here PLS," she said while pointing to a blank space on the document. Max picked up the paper and began reading it, stealing glances at Ms. Dunnant throughout, seeing her fidgety and increasingly anxious expression. While reading, his body also trembled for an instant, but it quickly returned to normal and allowed him to continue reading. However, the document itself was a very simple item. It was a non-disclosure document, preventing him from telling anyone about this discussion, or someone using this discussion as proof of anything in any court or higher authority. Well, all that only worked officially on the surface, since M19 would not mind torturing anyone and everyone to get what they wanted. After having read through the entire paper, Max took out a fine pen which had cost him a grand total of £1, and signed the paper. Only then did Ms. Dunnant sigh in relief. "Not that I do not trust you, Mr. Verstappen, but my husband told me to get anyone who asks about the ownership of anything related to us, or the business to sign this before I talk. He did teach me a lot of things over the years we were together, most of which has allowed this shop to actually become so successful. Ms. Dunnant said with a hidden joy in her expression. He taught well. Ms. Dunnant, it appears I won't have to worry about someone swindling you of your money or worse, the business anytime soon. Yes, thank you. Anyways, the land is owned by me. My husband had made the company and rented it from me. As for the company, my husband and I owned half and half of it, but it was all transferred to me after his passing. As for supply, well, my little children here go and explore the city every day and buy anything new that is cheap enough, or bring back information about expensive items. Then based on whether someone might want it, I purchase it and bring it here. I see. Max nodded, his feeling about this business was growing more and more. But then, he told her something. Ms. Dunnant, I would like to ask why you send all the money earned to your family. What about your husband's family? And why even send all the money? Shouldn't you keep some for yourself? What will I do with keeping money for myself? And the money I give it to my husband's family only. Not to my own family. They are already gone from this world, she said, a deep sadness replacing the joy that had appeared on her face only for a few brief moments. All of a sudden, one of the young men barged into the room and said with overflowing confidence. Nonsense, mother. We need money. We need it for better food. We need it for better clothes. We need it for toys, and other things. One by one, the other young men and women walked in and added to Cash others' sentences, completing it with a triumphant stance as though they were Power Rangers posing in front of the villain for no reason as explosions occur behind them for even less reason. Max held back his laugh at the comical sigh, turned back to Ms. Dunnant and smiled. As you can see, Monsi is very important for survival. If not for yourself, at least for your children. Investment in abilities. Max yawned as he exited, stretching his hands into the evening sky. However, his hands got stuck there, and this time, it was for a good 2 seconds before he finally returned to normal and continued his steps. It was a rather odd feeling when his body would just stop. It was a feeling similar to having a burp come up all the way to your throat, but then being halted in its progress to release by either you swallowing something or some other event, resulting in a giant lump becoming stuck in your throat. But Max felt it all over his body. However, he did not let this unsettle him as he smiled and continued to the road and stopped a single-horse carriage to take him to his home. It was not too far from his current location, the Dunnant's department store. In the carriage, Max recalled the deal he had struck with Ms. Dunnant. I wish to invest £1,000 to take 51% of the Dunnant's department store. Furthermore, I will also be willing to provide a loan of £1,000 at 5% interest in case the original capital is used up. Of course, you will be the entrepreneur of the store unless it begins to make losses in daily operations. But I will also have to explain a lot of financial terms to some of you so that we can communicate more effectively. All right, she said, as her children also nodded upon reading the entirety of the contract. They knew their mother was good at managing the business, but too weak-willed to actually hold on to money herself and would just end up giving everything away to her husband's family. Based on the contract, this youth was intending to change that. I will also tell you that I envision many changes to the story itself, as well as many expansions. And most importantly, I would like you to stop sending money to your husband's family. Send over just enough for them to survive. Around £20 per year. Also, from the moment you accept the investment, I would like to inform you that the company, Dunnant's department store and you are separate entities. This will take some time to explain. And thus, Max had spent all day explaining various aspects of accounting in the business to Ms. Dunnant, and her children, taking a break for lunch and high tea of course. What kind of savage does not have high tea? From the expressions he got from the children, Max had quickly sorted out which of them were better for what kinds of positions. Two of them, Gloria and Quentin, were especially suited for handling the accounts of the company, and Max intended to hand it over to them, considering how weak-willed Ms. Dunnant seemed. Max could have very well created his own company and followed the plan of Ms. Dunnant, making a rather successful business. However, there were two reasons he did not do this. Firstly, he did not want to go through the effort of becoming an entrepreneur himself, and would rather be the investor who helped startups by giving advice and finance, and then departing when the time was right with a hefty profit. Secondly, he simply lacked the skills to handle people. He could easily supervise those placed under him in the hierarchy, and handle such tasks with great efficiency. He could also casely follow the orders of superiors, and more importantly, butter them up until he got promotions. However, searching for talent and hiring them as cheaply as possible was not his forte. That was something better left to the blood-sucking HR department, and he knew this was not his strongest suit. If it was just one or two people, he would be able to handle things, but with the scale he wanted to expand, he would not be able to handle it. On the other hand, the way Ms. Dunant had skillfully hired her now adopted children and allowed them to become incredibly close in whatever short period of time they had spent together signified a lot about her skills in people management. As such, he could leave her in charge of the Dunant department store's expansion while searching for a more talented CEO for later. Upon the time he could shift her to be the head of the hour department of the company. Max returned to his home after getting out of the carriage and paying the driver. His current savings had reduced by a significant sum, but he still had enough for one more, smaller investment. But he could think about that later. For now, Max sat down on his soft bed and closed his eyes. He then thought about the honorific name he had created for himself. The unity of the time. The almighty singularity. The ruler of the three realms. Universal amalgamation of all. And with that, Max felt his soul being stretched into a thin noodle and being shot into the sky, before mysteriously appearing inside the Unity Sephiroth. Unlike the Saphira Castle, the universal amalgamation of all did not have a mysterious fog billowing through it, nor was it in the shape of a castle. Instead, it was essentially just two square tubes, one forming a circle, the other forming a three-petal shape, both tubes crossing each other and meeting at specific points. Each of these points formed larger rooms, of sorts, while the rest were all just normal pathways with a floor, a ceiling, and curved walls. All the floors and walls, as well as the ceiling, were bright white. And around Max, there was a considerably thick, glowing black fluid with the consistency of tar. Yet, the moment he thought about it, the feeling of restriction immediately vanished, despite the white glowing liquid still being around him. Max felt an odd sense of familiarity with this liquid as he began to control it to flow around him. It took only a few seconds for him to realize that this feeling stemmed from the will of unity that had begun slowly fusing with his own soul. It was slow, but while he was in the Unity Sephiroth, the speed was actually visible. If he remained here non-stop, the soul fragment should completely fuse with him in about a month or two at most. The feeling of familiarity originated from the fact that the universal amalgamation of all was originally a part of Unity's original body. This, instinctively it knew how to control it, and now that whatever was left of Unity's original soul had fused with Max's, it also gave him a certain amount of instinctual control over the black liquid that filled all of the space within the white Sephiroth. Max could feel that with every passing second, more and more of the black tar-like liquid was being collected within the Sephiroth, while the liquid that was originally within the Sephiroth was being compressed to make space for more of the liquid. Of course, the first thing that was created by the white walls of the Sephiroth was actually a black mist, which was slowly compressed into drops of liquid under the same compressive force that compressed the existing liquid into smaller and smaller space. Clearly, soon solid black tar would also be formed. But based on this speed, it would take a really long time, and Max was not here for that. Max looked outside the Sephiroth and noticed that he could see a lot. He could see the infinite vacuum of space in one direction, and the disgusting red blood world created by her on the moon, turning it from its original white to the current red. Back to the endless cosmos, Max saw countless galaxies, each having hundreds of billions of stars, each having their own star systems with an incredible number of planets. Some of these planets may very well be habitable, some even having the possibility of having nurtured life in the past, present, or nurturing in the future. Max's thoughts raced as he thought of a daring idea, one that would prevent him from coming at odds with the official churches or other super powerful beings. Max understood that considering the fact that he needed a ritual for his very first Sequence 9 to prevent himself from losing control, having anchors in his pathway would be vital. Especially after seeing the conditions for advancing to Sequence 7. As such, he would ultimately need to have his own church, which had a large population of believers that would prevent him from completely losing control while fighting or advancing through sequences. But this would directly bring him in conflict with the official and unofficial churches belonging to true gods and angels and kings of angels respectively, as well as the few oddities among Beyonder organizations. There was a solution to this thought. As long as he could come into contact with one or two of those civilizations from the cosmos that the outer gods had not whipped out yet for whatever reason, he could potentially gain a large number of believers in a short period of time. Max smiled as he finally put his attention to the Sephiroth and its powers. Abilities and expansion plans. Sephiroth's most important ability was to allow Max to use the abilities of one sequence above him until sequence 1, then it would just strengthen his abilities. However, that was for something in the far future. For now, Max focused on the abilities of Fool's End that he now had access to. Considering how lackluster the abilities of Bender were, the Fool's End abilities most definitely made up for them. For starts, his Attract and Repel were now 30% stronger, meaning they could move heavier objects or lighter ones with much more force. These two abilities also had their precision improved, and Max wanted to test it out, but there was nothing within the Sephiroth for him to attract or repel. Thus, he simply used the powers of the black tar to product a pen, and then tried to control it only using his abilities. Instead of flying directly at his face, Max was now able to subtly control the speed at which he wanted it to fly at him. And, if he used repel at the same time as attract, he could essentially make the object float perfectly still. This was something he could easily do by just controlling the glowing black fluid around him, but he could not do it only by using his abilities, which meant that once he advanced to Fool's End, he would also be able to do it on Earth, which was something very useful. Other than this strengthening, his density manipulation also went through an improvement which now allowed him to change the density by another 20% more than before, and of objects 5 meters around him instead of having to directly touch things to do it. Of course, as before, the larger or denser the object, the more spirituality would be consumed. Max dissolved the black pen, which would not work due to the lack of ink and moving components within the pen, back to black liquid. Max's control over the substance that he could only assume was a similar substance to the gray fog from the Saphira Castle was not great. He could control all the liquid within the Sephiroth, but not with enough skill to produce incredibly tiny moving parts such as the stuff found in watches. Creating simple and large objects thought was very possible. Next came the juicy part, his new abilities. He can fool the abilities of other Beyonders. How stupidly overpowered was that? Unfortunately, it was limited to only those of Sequence 8, but it was still something that was stupidly overpowered. And of course, it came with its own series of stupidly overpriced spirituality consumption for each use of the ability. Plus, this ability was essentially useless here since there was no other Beyonder for him to experiment with or use the ability on. But it would be incredibly useful once he reached Sequence 8 with his real body. Next came the abilities that were the most useful to the current Max. They were the Anti-Divination, Anti-Intuition, and Anti-Illusion abilities which effectively destroyed the usefulness of the Sequence 9 Seer, and have the usefulness of the rest of the Fool's Pathway. Though these only apply to those that are below Sequence 8. Equipped with just these abilities, he could easily just destroy Klein if he did not have the Saphira Castle. There was something rather different about these abilities, and that was the fact that just like Danger Intuition ability, these abilities were also passive and always active, and did not use up his spirituality unless they were being used to thwart actual attempts like Divination and Illusion or Intuition suppression. Other than these abilities, the Fool's End also allowed Max to substitute himself with paper figurines, to either exchange places with it or use it as a distraction. These could also be used to avoid hexes and curses, though not very successfully most of the time. Another very useful ability was that Mac could sense the historical void and enter it, while also being able to see spirit body threads. In a sense, the Fool's End had made him a nearly perfect hunter for the Fool's Pathway, other than the fact that it did not give him any physical enhancements. After having checked his Fool's End abilities, Mac finally got to work and began to think about how he would be able to make use of any of these abilities to help him in the real world below, and not just be useless. However, the only thing Max could think of at the moment was to just use Anti-Illusion and Anti-Divination every now and then to ensure he was not being spied on by others. However, it was not very effective for the latter since Divination is not usually done for a long period of time and only lasts for a few moments, a few seconds at best. Meanwhile, he might actually be able to use Anti-Illusion to allow his main body to escape certain situations if need be, especially in cases where he was being manipulated by extremely powerful Beyonders or artifacts. Thus, creating the habit of checking every single day could only benefit him. The paper figurines substitution would not work outside the Sephiroth and thus was useless to Max. The only thing that he actually could use properly was the ability to see the historical void and enter it, but so far he had not used this ability unless he was searching for a hiding Beyonder of the Fool's Pathway. Thus, After using the anti-divination and anti-illusion abilities, and not noticing any drop in spirituality, Max closed his eyes and returned to his body by just thinking about it. Back in his body, Max sighed at the restrictions on his abilities and decided to go to sleep for the night and focus on improving his financial situation. As such, Max closed his eyes and went off to sleep, only waking up the next morning. June 12, 1348 of the 5th epoch. Max got up bright and early today after having a long night of almost perfect rest in his new home. After getting ready, Max headed out towards Dunnant's department store in preparation for finally getting the chance to change the format of the store. The current format was a waste of human resources and time for both the customer and the sellers, since the customers would have to browse through the various shelves of items. Plus, at least one worker would have to follow each customer while they purchased items, not only to help them but also to prevent thievery. Instead, Max had a completely remodeled plan for the store and any of its future outlets across Backland. It would no longer be a completely open store. Instead, the shop would mainly consist of a warehouse that customers do not have access to, and all items are sorted not for display, but for case of access to the workers of the shop, who would be the only ones involved in the retrieval of the items. Meanwhile, a small area would be turned into the general waiting area, where customers would wait their turn, as anywhere between 2 and 5 employees man their stations, taking requests from customers and retrieving the items, showing them to the customers, and then collecting payment. Max even had an idea to further divide the workforce and have only a single cashier who would not only collect the payment but also hand over the product to the customer, while the other workers only show the item for confirmation, handing a token to the customers to collect the item at the cashier. However, this would have to wait until Max had enough workers and educated them enough to work like so. A small portion of the remaining area was dedicated as the rest room for workers, and the rest of the space was dedicated to the special room for VIPs like nobility or people of high political or religious standing. These would have luxurious couches and tables, as well as refreshments, just in case. But these would all take time and money to carry out, and Max would also need to spend a long time to educate the workers, while slowly encouraging Ms. Victoria Dunnant to expand and hire more workers. Plus, he would have to do a lot of advertising, some even in person, but it was possible. And so, Max set off under the breaking dawn of the foggy Backland skyline. It had been a little over 2 months since Max had effectively taken over the Dunnant's department store. Currently, Max was at one of the countless parties where the rich and nobles gathered for social, political, business, personal, and other purposes. Max had made a conscious effort to try and get invited to some of these parties, mainly to form connections with the people here, establish himself as a nouveau riche, as well as find someone to share in his investment of the Dunnant's department store. After all, he was the only one financing it, and even after his £1,000 investment, Ms. Dunnant also had to borrow the £1,000 of 5% interest loan from Max to support the growth of the business itself. The only way to prevent others from copying their idea was to expand fast enough to almost completely take over the market in as little time as possible. For this, however, a lot of capital was needed, not only to purchase or rent the shops, but also for the inventory and the hiring of workers, both sales and suppliers. Max had divided the workers in 2 parts. The sales workers worked only in the shops, taking requests, searching and retrieving items, and collecting the money. The suppliers mainly worked in ensuring that all the inventories of each shop were kept up to date with the latest items and the largest varictics. In just these 2 months, they had created another 2 Dunnant's department stores, one in Sherwood Borough and one in West Borough. Though the former was essentially the same as the newly modified one at Hillston Borough, the one in West Borough, where a majority of the nobles lived, was rather different. A larger majority of the space of the shop was still occupied by the storage. However, there was no common waiting area. Only a single receptionist would inform people when a private room would be available for them to sit down for a cup of tea or coffee and some refreshments. These rooms were essentially the same as the VIP rooms of the normal department store in Hillston Borough. Although the profit margin was not a lot, it was enough to yield a hefty sum when goods were being sold in such large quantities. They had around 35 people working across all 3 shops, with an average salary of £2.5 per employee. Having paid himself £4.2 per month for each month just from his loan, Max had earned a profit of around £50 for each month, after combining the interest from the loan and the 51% of the company he owned, as well as reducing the taxes he would have to pay. Ms. Dunnant would have also earned just about a similar amount to Max, since 2% was not that big of a difference. Max had formed a few friends among the rich individuals, especially among those who were self-made, just like himself. And though these people he had been able to be invited to multiple such events, this particular one being his fourth party. Through these same friends, Max had also spread the news that he owned a majority stake in the recently growing Dunnant's department store, and that he was searching for someone of higher political and financial standing to take hold of the shop that was held a promising future and provide more support, something he was currently lacking. Today, he finally encountered someone interested in his shop, and to his surprise, it was someone who he had almost immediately recognized. She was a lady who was undoubtedly an incredible beauty in her youth, with bright golden hair, green eyes, and a beautifully graceful appearance. She looked in her mid-30s, but Max knew she was well in her 50s, another depiction of how her beauty had fooled most people of her actual age. "Mrs. Hall, what a pleasure it is to finally make your acquaintance. My name is Max Verstappen. What can this humble commoner do for you?" he said while giving an incredibly deep bow. He knew Mrs. Hall was not someone stuck up with traditions and nobility, however, he was of commoner origin, while she was the wife of a noble. As such, he simply could not be publicly seen being anywhere near a similar level to her, not just for his own safety, but also her reputation, and most importantly, the reputation and safety of his friends, borrowing whom he had been able to get access to such a noble and rich networking opportunity. Mrs. Caitlin Hall, the wife of Earl Hall and mother of the future Ms. Justice, Audrey Hall, was an intelligent woman. In this age where women were not easily given roles of power due to various reasons, including personal, political, and social, she was someone who handled a lot behind the scenes. Though it was not very evident, Max had understood from the undertones of the novel that she played a far greater role in the success of her husband than either of them let on. Of course, Earl Hall was not some weak-willed buffoon and was smart enough to succeed on his own. On the other hand, Mrs. Caitlin would not have access to the network or friends that Earl Hall had. As such, the two were very important for the success of Cash Other. But what was more important was that Max had a feeling he knew why she had approached him. Well, it had to be either for his Beander identity or because of the Dunnant's department store. And considering that she had just waved away her butler to talk to him, it was obvious that it was not the former, since that would put her in too much danger for the butler to listen to her order. "I do not have a lot of time to spend here, Mr. Verstappen. I have heard of a rumor that you own a large portion of a growing company. Is this truck?" Although she did not say it directly, Max smiled evilly on the inside but put in the most innocent smile of joy on his face, and he understood what she was here for and how he should progress. "Of course, my lady. We do have one store in Westboro. You can have one of your people meet me there and we can discuss anything and everything in detail there, with a lot more privacy and discreetness. Some matters are better off not exposed to others." Max left a lot of words unsaid, but the innocent smile on his face had vanished and a serious expression had replaced it, causing Mrs. Hall to understand the meaning behind it and nodding. "Very well then, but I do hope for a satisfactory ending to it, as compensation for having me wait for another day," she said as she turned around. Almost immediately, 3 people surrounded her. 2 were women of similar age to her, either her friends or her friends, and 1 was a younger gentleman, who was clearly related to one of the women. Max just smiled as he silently returned to the party and picked up one of the fresh juices available for those suffering from having too much alcohol. His current body was not well suited to alcohol consumption, and even if it was in this fantasy world, he knew one thing for sure: drinking, smoking, and basically anything that was addicting, including gambling and fighting, was bad for one's health in the long run. In fact, doing anything too frequently or too much would lead to long-term problems. As such, he just spent the evening sampling the vast variety of food and juices before bidding his friends farewell and leaving. On the way out, he noticed that Mrs. Hall was not present anywhere. Well, she is indeed very busy, and likely had to have to various other parties or to a party that Mr. Hall himself was throwing. All the nobles of Leon do end up having too much free time and spend almost half the year partying in Backland, and the other half chilling in their homes across Leon. Some actually manage their fiefs or businesses, but not most of them, which was one of the many reasons for the falling likability of the nobility. Max thought to himself as he returned home. Dealings with the Hall. August 15, 1348 of the 5th epoch. The very first thing Max did when he got ready after waking up was quickly heading to Mr. Eckhart's residency, which looked eerily similar to Detective Isengard's home, both doubling as their workspaces. After discussing with the aged lawyer, Max brought along the cross-dressing Brenda with him, under the strong recommendation of the aged lawyer that she was just as good as any lawyer he would get his hands on for this deal. Of course, he would naturally have to pay a good amount of fees for her services, but it was not too much. Immediately after getting Brenda on board, Max took a carriage with her in tow, directly to the Dunnant's department store in the West Borough. Here, Brenda and himself had a small breakfast since neither of the two had had anything to cat this Carly in the morning. Then, they waited. Brenda waited in the waiting room of the store, which was equivalent to the VIP meeting rooms of the other stores that were in less affluent areas. Meanwhile, Max decided to go around and ensure that the shop was working properly. He had not spent too much time inspecting cash of his shops since he was busy trying to get invited to the various parties of nobility without coming under the radar of the various Beander organizations who had their interests lying with the nobility of Backland. After a few hours, someone finally came to the shop who did not belong. It was the duo of an incredibly well-dressed aged butler and a sharp-looking middle-aged man who was holding a briefcase. Almost immediately Max had the feeling that this person was a lawyer, and he was not wrong. "Excuse me, have the two of you gentlemen been sent by someone?" Max asked, pushing aside the young girl who was initially heading over to take them to one of the rooms like all the other customers. "Ah, you must be Mr. Verstappen. We have been sent by Mrs. Hall to meet with you." "I see, please follow me," Max said as he took the two of them to one of the rooms, where Brenda was seated, getting increasingly bored. As soon as Max entered, he was stumped to find Brenda performing what he could only assume were yoga poses on the ground, something incredibly unladylike, as they say in this era. Though there were countless women in the novel who utterly destroyed this notion, including a certain goddess. Still, considering that the two men who just entered only saw a young man stretching on the ground, they just stood still for a moment before quickly recovering themselves. Max had them sit opposite to himself and Brenda, whose face was now almost as red as a tomato. "All right, gentlemen, before we begin, I would like to ask if you are able to sign any deals on behalf of Mrs. Hall." It was the bearded butler who spoke first, clearing his throat before doing so. "No, actually, we have been instructed by Lady Hall to sign the deal on behalf of the young Lady Hall." "Ms. Audrey Hall?" Max asked tentatively, as many things gradually fell into place. Such a shop was one of the riskier businesses since it might be shut down at any moment. However, compared to low interest rates from banks or appreciation from land, the Dunnant's department store was the perfect, risky diversification for a portfolio that has been stuffed to the brim with low risk and low growth rate investments like the ones that were likely to have been invested in for Audrey's future by her parents. Of course, Mrs. Hall would not need to invest in Max's business that desperately to the point she had come to personally visit him at the party. Instead, she had come over to secure a potentially rapidly growing business investment for her daughter's future. Most likely, the investments she had already thrown money in were too low risk and thus grew in value too slowly to actually be of much use in the future. Thus, the current meeting was occurring. The butler nodded, and Max smiled. "All right then, I will not beat around the bush. I would like to ask a few questions and hope for answers. Till then, Mr. Lawyer, I have prepared 3 sets of contracts for the 3 different objectives of Ms. Hall. The first one is in case she wishes to purchase all my shares and remove me from the business, taking 51% of it for herself. I have not allowed any of the original owner, Ms. Dunnant's shares to be sold since I hope that she remains as an owner of the business to be sufficiently motivated to operate most of it. Might I add, she is incredible at recruiting and training people. The second is in case Ms. Hall wants to just invest money in the form of a loan at a 10% interest rate, higher than the current bank rates by quite a bit I might add. The value is up for discussion. The last contract is a split. We split the company. I have already spoken to Ms. Dunnant, and she would not mind reducing her stake as long as mine is also reduced, but still allowing us to maintain the majority if we both were of the same mind. As such, it will include Ms. Hall holding 35%, Ms. Dunnant holding 30%, and myself holding 35%. The amount for this transaction would need to be discussed, though I have also left the percentages in this account blank. My lawyer here will be up for any discussions regarding clauses of contracts you may have." Max said as he gestured for Brenda and the middle-aged lawyer to head to the side seating arrangement to discuss the contracts, while he began to ask questions to the old butler, who seemed slightly impressed at the professionalism. "Well, as I had said earlier, I do have some questions." That will also rule out some of the contracts. Does Ms. Hall wish to remove me from the company? I do not mind, since I had come here specifically as an investment, so it would be beneficial for me as well. Max said, with a nonchalant smile. However, he did not want this outcome since the Dunnance department store was one of the few rather innovative ideas. Well, if Mr. Verstappen wishes to leave the company, there is nothing the young lady can do. All right, Mr. Butler, I have been straightforward with you, and I hope to receive the same outcome. After all, we do not want to keep Mrs. Hall waiting now, do we? Does she want me out? No, the butler was only momentarily stumped at my sudden shift of tone and mood but recovered just as quickly. Good, so, the first contract is useless. Max said slightly louder so the due of lawyers could hear and let go of discussions regarding the first contract. And what about a plain financial investment? No, so no to the second contract as well, he said, again raising his voice slightly, inwardly also rejoicing at the outcome. Now came the final discussion, but he would rather not waste a lot of time discussing over 1% of the stake with an old butler. He had a rough approximation of their lowest acceptable limit for a given value, so he directly went to it and told that it was Ms. Dunnance's last value and nothing more could be accepted. The butler was once again at a loss for words, as Max had come incredibly close to the lowest amount of stake Lady Hall had given to him to take on before breaking the deal for anything smaller, and also considerably close to the highest amount of investment for that particular amount of capital. But ultimately he nodded, and Max finally smiled. He agreed, he was not the smartest out there, nor the strongest in terms of physical or beyonder powers. However, one thing he did know was how to adapt to situations, especially in business, and make things flow in the direction he wanted. In a sense, he had a natural flair for business, despite not actually being too smart or quick at it. Anyways, Max ended up diluting his own stake in Ms. Dunnance's stake in the Dunnance department store, resulting in her having only 27%, while he had only 33%. Meanwhile, Ms. Audrey Hall would end up with 40% of the company, all while investing £3,000 directly into the company. However, one condition within the contract was that Mrs. Hall would help them find a CEO for the company. Ms. Dunnant also knew her lacking ability to handle a growing multi-location company like this one and knew she would need someone to help her. Max had already talked with her about a possible investor and asked them to help bring in someone to handle the overall working of the company, as well as someone who could handle the finances of the company such that they would have to pay the least taxes to the government, without getting into trouble. As such, many of his problems would be solved, other than the fact that he would have to wait for a considerable amount of time before being able to invest such a large sum all at once again. For now, Max's bank account only held around £1,000, including the amounts he had spent since he arrived at Backland and the amount he earned from the Dunnance department store earnings. Well, I still should try and find something to invest at least £500 into, keeping £10 to £20 in cash for safety, and throwing the rest into a savings account. Max thought as he smiled at the 2 cards left behind by the departing butler. It was the private contact information of Mrs. Hall, as well as an invitation to an upcoming party in a few days. 2 months and changes, September 24, 1348 of the 5th epoch. With another month passing, and Max earned another £75. They had expanded the number of Dunnance department stores across Backland to 6 in total using the funds from Ms. Hall. Of course, not all of these stores were as profitable as the others, resulting in a smaller increase in profits despite the doubling in the total number of stores, and a further increase in the number of employees. Other than that, an experienced CEO was hired for handling the entire organization, and a headquarters was set up in Hillstone Borough. This was done to better manage the overall Dunnance department store company, handle its finances and employees, as well as goods and obligations to suppliers and the government. Unfortunately, over this past month, Max had not found a suitable investment option. He had searched various platforms including even reading through the newspapers one at a time to find something, but either the startups were bound to fail due to an inherent flaw in the concept or execution, or it required an incredible investment to actually work out, something he lacked at the moment. Max had played with the idea of creating something modern like the bike that Klein had invested in and proliferated all through Backland. However, he almost immediately shoved the idea aside as he recalled the fact that a certain goddess was also from his era, and would recognize it for what the invention was. As such, unless he had someone in this era personally come up with the idea, without his involvement until the investment was needed, he would not be able to bring out the past, or future inventions depending on whether you were talking from a historical or technological point of view. However, Max had other benefits. Max had been able to source 2 of the 12 ingredients for his Fool's End potion. And, it would only take him another week for him to get his hands on another 3. Speaking of Beander potions, Max realized something very important. The uniqueness of his pathway required a Beander characteristic from all of the 22 orthodox pathways for it to be created. But more importantly, for him to advance to a Great Old One, the Outer God Unity, Max would need to get small samples of each of the various Sephiroth. This would only mean one thing. Just like the fact that he was an enemy of the individuals of his neighboring pathway, the 3 other transmigrators still orbiting the Earth, Max would have to allow Klein to grow, and preferably speed up the process until he was able to free the other Sephiroth from the seal placed by him, all while preparing to utterly destroy Klein and other possible Great Old Ones who are formed from Earth, since he was an outer god. Well, he would also have to fight off the other outer gods and prevent them from firstly utterly destroying the Earth and everything living on it, and secondly, assimilating with other Sephiroth from Earth, since that would create an unending spiraling of merging of Beander characteristics until the creator was reborn, or something worse came about. Thus, his original direction of just being completely opposed to Klein would have to be reformed into helping Klein reach Great Old One before killing him, but only after he unsealed the rest of the Sephiroth. Sigh, what a headache, Max thought as he realized he would have to place a delicate juggling balance between various Beyonders, forces, and other beings, all while plotting not only to kill most of them but also growing his own strength in the process. It was an absolute mess that even the smartest minds would have a hard time following, and Max would have to handle them on his OWTI. Sighing, Max took another sip of the freshly squeezed grape juice, which looked similar to wine in more aspects other than the color and consistency. Though from a distance it did look like wine, and that was exactly what Max was going for. Currently, he was at another one of the parties for nobility, but this time he did not have to suck up to some random rich merchants to bring him along. This time, however, he was cordially invited by the host, and all of this only happened because he had been invited to the hall banquet, where he was first introduced to Ms. Audrey Hall, who was officially the one to own a significant part of Dunnant's department store. Sipping on the grape juice, Max observed the various individuals around him. The group of elderly gentlemen, casually discussing serious business within their group, as though the world around them did not exist. In sharp contrast, the group of elderly women just sitting by the side, glaring daggers at everyone as though they owed them money from countless years ago. However, the groups that stood out the most were the young women, who were rather loudly conversing amongst each other, randomly bursting out into fits of giggles. Somehow, this also attracted random strays of young and peacock-like men, who fancied themselves the main characters of their lives, despite that fact being true to some extent. These young men would try and ask for some of the young women for a dance, however many of them ended up getting rejected. Unlike the extremely high-classed parties hosted by the likes of the Hall family, this one was a lot simpler, only in comparison though. It still had a vast array of foods and beverages, and had sufficient staff to run an upper-middle-class family to the ground in under a few weeks just from salary alone. Still, compared to the exceedingly organized hall banquet, the current one had a much more informal and lackadaisical atmosphere that allowed 2 things. It lowered the nerves of first-timers, while also reducing the requirements for people to insert themselves into the conversations of others, since the hierarchy was a little less strictly handled at this party. As such, Max took a slightly larger sip of his juice and placed the wine glass onto the table behind him, before casually walking towards a certain group of people. This was a group of middle-aged individuals. They wore considerably decent clothes, but nothing too extravagant. Among these people, Max also had a few friends who had similar views as himself, thus bringing him along with them to the first few parties. These people were not nobility, and instead were moderately wealthy individuals or had high political or financial standing among non-nobles. As such, they are in a state of limbo, an odd social status of the in-between, neither a noble nor a commoner. Max, despite being just a child, confidentially walked up to this group and inserted himself without any issues, with the people here almost instantly accepting him as one of them. To their credit, Max's body had grown to look closer to an adult after consuming his Bender potion, and his way of speaking made them forget about the age he looked. To them, he was one of them, someone from the lower rungs of society, who clawed their way up to their current position through hard work, determination, and sheer will. He was a self-made man, just like them. In order to fit in with these individuals, Max was thankful for Samuel's life experiences as he made use of his considerable life and business experience to almost immediately hit it off with the middle-aged group. Unlike the gossiping young women, the judgy old ladies, the horny and bombastic young men and the super stuck-up old men, this group of middle-aged men were more goal-focused. They were here at these functions for two specific interests, the first being networking and coming into contact with potential business partners, and the second being finding individuals of similar interests with whom to align their families with. Well, Max was mainly here for the former, and perhaps the latter after a few years. Despite his body having aged to that of a young adult, and having Samuel's memories, Max was still a child. His interests did not lean so desperately towards gaining an intimate partner yet. After a while of talking, Max shook the hands of 3 of the individuals present, before taking his leave. He was, after all, not a member of their group, and only someone with similarly aligning interests who was temporarily accepted. It was something similar to high schoolers playing football, accepting Max, a 10th grader, to join their team just to make up the numbers since he was conveniently there. As soon as the match was over, he would naturally be meant to leave them alone. However, if he was able to be selected to join them to play often enough, he would ultimately be accepted as one of them, and this was his final goal. Gaining power and rich potential partners in his future endeavors would allow him to reduce the risks and oppositions he might otherwise face. Max was not trying to become the richest person in Backland. Far from it, he was just trying to set up a stable portfolio of investments that would supply him with a decent amount of money to allow Max to focus on other aspects. Thus, Max departed the banquet a little before normal, and this was due to the significant gains he had made this time. Banquet contacts. Through this latest banquet, Max had been able to gain the contacts of 2 individuals, each for differing reasons. The first among this group was Mr. Reginald. He was the head of a merchant group named Florence House. Essentially, it is involved in obtaining interesting items from all over Backland, and setting up auctions to sell them to the wealthier population of the city. As Max explained his business to Mr. Reginald, and the latter explained his own business to Max, the two almost immediately hit it off. Although nothing important could be discussed in such a public location among others who could be either potential partners or competitors, Max and Mr. Reginald decided to meet in person in 5 days' time to discuss more. Still, Max already understood briefly what Mr. Reginald wanted, a more stable income, while he just wanted more income in total, both of which were satisfied by the other companies owned by each other. Thus, discussions might be very beneficial. Still, Max needed to first discuss with Mr. Audrey Hall and Mrs. Dunnant before the meeting. Immediately, he wrote a letter to Mrs. Hall, the wife of Earl Hall and mother of Audrey Hall. Despite the name of young Ms. Justice being written on the contract of splitting the ownership, most of his interactions happened through Mrs. Hall, as it is within her rights as Ms. Hall's legal guardian. In the letter, he mentioned Mr. Reginald, and his situation of wanting a more stable income. He also mentioned about his business and the likelihood that he might want some ownership of the Dunnant's department store in their upcoming talks. In the letter, he mentioned the potential of having the 2 companies work together, perhaps even merge at some point. However, he knew that perhaps this was not what Mrs. Hall might want since it would utterly destroy her ownership of the company. Thus, he put up many potential options, including the option of last resort where he would just exchange portions of his own ownership with that of Mr. Reginald, and simply reduce his own ownership of Dunnant's department store in exchange for a more diversified portfolio. Of course, in between an aggressive merger of the 2 companies and just an exchange of a small portion of ownership, Max had informed Mrs. Hall to give him what she might be willing to accept, and focus on that during his discussion with Mr. Reginald. Max also decided to have a talk with Ms. Dunnant the next day regarding this very matter. After all, such a decision, even the most conservative of exchanging shares, would affect her to an extent, so it was best to have her opinions on it before even heading off into any discussions. Other than his brief but fruitful contact with Mr. Reginald, Max had also come into contact with another individual, Mr. Terrence. He was the son-in-law of a minority partner to a major trade consortium that handled trade between the Leon Kingdom and the Fanapotter Kingdom. From what little Max had gathered in the interactions between Mr. Terrence and the others at the banquet, he was definitely not someone who was looked up to by the middle-aged men. In fact, he was someone who barely fit in with the group, since his only wealth lay in his connection to the trade consortium, and nothing else. He did not have much money under his own name, and just lived off the wealth of his in-laws. Essentially, His wife was the breadwinner of the family, though she too did not do much, just received monthly spending allowances from her father. Still, Mr. Terence had something that was rather important to Max, and that was contacts. Mr. Terence had been to countless private and public functions and made many friends, despite not involving them in any political or financial deals of any sort. He was exactly the kind of guy everyone would like to hang out with at parties, and perhaps this nonchalant attitude was what allowed him to make friends with people. Mr. Terence did not have much ambition and was satisfied with his life, especially since he could just enjoy it to his heart's content with his wife without any worries about money or expenses. Thus, he never tried to even mention trade deals or anything of the sort to others, and ended up becoming considerable friends with almost all the significant individuals of Backland. In essence, if someone wanted to meet someone or get introduced to someone in a slightly informal location like a party, they would first visit Mr. Terence, who would gladly bring them around. And this was also Max's goal. He needed access to the higher rungs of Backland without actually going through the proper methods, since that would take a lot of money, and even more time to accomplish. Max had already come into contact with Mrs. Hall, who was considered to be quite high up on the ladder of society, but Max wanted to come into contact with others at this level. After all, he would need to have a lot of contacts if he wanted to proceed with the creation of his own Beyonder organization. In order to recruit Beyonders, he would naturally need to employ less than legal methods, and many of them would require the involvement of someone higher up on the chain of command to allow him to get away with them. The talk Max had with Mr. Terence was different from the one with Mr. Reginald. This time, Max only talked with him to introduce him to others of high standing at the next party they end up meeting each other. Max especially wanted to get acquainted with some of the owners of banks to allow him to take out a low-interest loan for investment without having to put too much collateral. But this was something that would only happen after a week or so, since Mr. Terence apparently would not be joining any parties for the week due to his wife's health. But still, it was progress that Max was satisfied with, and he returned to his spacious rented home and went to bed, to enjoy another peaceful night of sleep. September 27, 1348 of the 5th epoch. 3 days passed in a flash. Max had already talked to Ms. Dunnant and had received a letter from Mrs. Hall. He had already discussed what they were willing to give up for this cooperation and took note of their bottom lines as well as their expectations. Ms. Dunnant did not have much expectation but hoped that someone other than the current 3 people already owning a stake in the company would not gain too much stake, while Mrs. Hall was not willing to dilute her own shares by more than 10% of what it currently was, while also wanting to remain the largest shareholder in the business. As such, Max would likely only end up exchanging some shares with Mr. Reginald rather than merging the companies, but this was also a good thing for him, as he would not have to give up a lot of the profit from the Florence house. Naturally, Max had already paid a visit to Mr. Eckhart and Brenda, to get them to write down a few possible contracts that might be useful to immediately sign a deal with Mr. Reginald. Of course, Max made sure to leave some empty spaces for potential investors who owned parts of Mr. Reginald's business if that was the case, but it was all speculation until he actually went ahead and talked with the man, and that was exactly what Max was going to do right now. Investment expansion and future. Max sat down on the leather couch with a smile as he set down his top hat beside him. On the other side of the dark wood table was Mr. Reginald, similarly seated on a leather couch. The atmosphere of the room was considerably calming due to all the warm colors used in the furniture and walls, as well as the distinct yellow light coming from the gas lamps near the top of the room. "Welcome, Mr. Verstappen, to my humble home. Please, Mr. Reginald, call me Max. I am much younger than you think I am. All right then, Max, I would like to thank you for coming to meet me so early in the morning. Before we started, tell me, what would you have? Tea, coffee? I'll have just plain milk," he replied with a straight face, a reply which caused Mr. Reginald's face to twitch ever so slightly. Still, he nodded and got up, went to the next room before returning with a glass of milk and a glass of water for himself. After seeing Mr. Reginald sit down, Max took a courtesy sip of the milk before placing it back onto the table and smiling as the man in front of him. "All right then, let us get down to business. As you should already know, my business is Florence House, which is an auction house that is considerably famous in the circles of the elites and nobles of Backland. But your earnings are not consistent enough for your own living expenses, or for the expenses of the business. You need a reliable source of odd items in order to be able to sell more items more often, one that does not have a chance of selling you fraudulent items and at a reliably consistent pace. Is that correct? Max finished his sentence. That is true. However, I am also interested in the company you have ownership of. Dunnant's department store, if I am not mistaken. Yes, Max nodded before smiling. The department store often receives miscellaneous items of possible high worth, and I feel like it would be beneficial for both companies to establish a supply contract where we supply you with random items we come across for a price that is acceptable to both parties, while you can sell it for whatever you want. Alternatively, you could just take our items and sell them, giving us back most of the earnings and only keeping a small fee for your Florence house. But I am getting ahead of myself here. First and foremost, I can tell you that there are 2 other stakeholders in the Dunnant's department store, and I have already discussed with them about this meeting, and I can honestly say that I represent all of them, including myself. As such, I represent the entire Dunnant's department store for this discussion. What about you? I suppose it is not some secret. The Florence house is split in ownership. 10% is with my younger brother who helped me source the land to build the auction house. But he always listens to me, so I suppose I can also represent the Florence house. I wouldn't be so sure. Max internally mocked as he had seen many familial relationships being torn apart due to greed. In fact, the wealthier and more comfortable lives humans had, the worse their actions would be towards those of their own family and close friends. For those struggling at the bottom, generally the family would stick together through thick and thin, except for extreme cases where people give up on life by drinking or smoking, or worse, physically give up. Either way, since Mr. Reginald owned 90% of the company, he could indeed represent it. All right, Mr. Reginald, I have a few deals to make with you, so let us get right to it. Max left Mr. Reginald's house with 2 signed documents. One of them was a contract of purchase where the Florence house would purchase any and all sufficiently intriguing items from Dunnant's department store. The prices for all categories of items were listed in the contract itself in a table, along with conditions that would make the price rise or fall and by how much as well. Everything was very well written in the contract, and Max had to pay a considerable sum to Mr. Eckhart to get him to write it all out. Still, Max was sure it was actually Brenda who had written it, and Mr. Eckhart was just reading through it to confirm it before giving it to Max, but this was exactly what he had paid for. The proofreading done by this senior lawyer was well worth it. The second contract Max had was a much more private deal. It involved an exchange of stakes. As it turned out, Mr. Reginald had already gotten a written and signed authorization letter from his younger brother who allowed him to dilute the shares of the company in order to give some stake to Max, without changing the ownership structure between the 2 brothers. As such, Max had gotten 20% of the Florence house, with Mr. Reginald's brother owning 8% and Mr. Reginald owning 72%. Meanwhile, for Dunnant's department store, Max's 33% stake was reduced to 30% with the remaining 3% being given to the Florence house's ownership in exchange for Max's 20%. Meanwhile, Mrs. Dunnant's stake did not reduce more than her previous 27% and Ms. Hall's stake also did not reduce more than 40%. The exchange of 3% for 20% might seem unfair, but considering how much the current financial statements differed between the 2 companies, it was actually a rather palatable deal. Perhaps someone with a narrower view and more cutthroat attitude might have only given 1% for a 20% stake, but Max wanted to keep the 2 brothers satisfied with him. Plus, he had a vision of the potential of such an auction house and wanted it to reach its future potential. For this, Max had also specified many things to Mr. Reginald, many of them making a lot of sense to him, including the fact that they should improve the quality of clothing and furniture of the auction house. Of course, Max had also visited the auction house that was just around the corner while the 2 were still discussing the deal. One of the important factors that Max had asked was whether the auction house was built by them on land that they bought or just a building that he had rented. Thankfully, it turned out that they had rented it, and that was something Max was greatly satisfied with. After all, the deadly fog of doom that would be unleashed onto Backland by certain individuals and groups would utterly destroy the finances of Backland in the short term, and owning any land before this period of time was stupid. In fact, shoring up money in order to purchase land right after the disaster would be the best way for him to gain a lot of land, which was one of the most important aspects of wealth to human society since the beginning of civilization itself. Till this time, however, Max would have to rapidly grow his businesses and prepare a large amount of money before the incident, in order to quickly make use of it to make specific purchases in the Backland. And this was exactly what Max was intending to do. Now, He would sit back and collect money from his businesses while making connections in the higher circles of Leon and Backland, and then invest the money into more investments to get more money. In just a few months, his financial backing should have become considerably stronger, and this would be further boosted if he was able to take a loan from a bank. Max would try to do this, since the alternative to this was to either sit back and passively collect money, or create a company and sell the shares to someone. But that would be giving up control over his wealth to someone else, and Max did not have the bad habit of giving out his own power. Max had seen enough cases both in real life and in movies, novels, and comics to know that giving up a share of your own power, be it in the form of equity of your company or the secrets to your powers, always ended up in ruin. The only reason those protagonists survived stupid decisions like this was purely due to the whims of their author and the so-called plot armor. Clearly, Max was not one. The only protagonist in this world was Klein, and perhaps a certain goddess. Maybe, the true protagonist of the entire story was a certain angel who was the reincarnation of an even more overpowering god who had lived through all epochs. But that was a tale for another time. 1 year older, 1 year less to live. June 27, 1349 of the 5th epoch. Currently, Max was on a steam locomotive. The constant fog of Backland was being left behind as he headed towards the city of universities, Tingen. Over the past year, Max had successfully achieved one of his goals. And that was to build a successful portfolio of investments in Backland such that he would not have to worry about money for the predictable future. Through his investments, he was now earning around £300 per month. This figure included the £75 he made per month just from his 30% in the Dunnance department store. Unfortunately, from these £300, Max would end up paying almost £70 in taxes, while he would end up paying another £40 to the banks as his monthly installments for repaying the loans he took from them. This would continue for another 3 years until the loan was repaid. Still, Max was sure he would be able to repay the full loan by the end of the year, to remove this expense through his £190 profit he made per month. One of the main reasons he had been able to successfully make such a high earning yield from just around £1,500 of bank loans, was due to his method of carning them. He first took over a promising business, becoming its majority stakeholder while still leaving enough for the proprietor to make an effort to push the company into success, just like he had done with the Dunnance department store. Then, he would help it by providing ideas and connections to rapidly grow the business until one of his connections declared some interest in his latest venture. Here, he accepted them, giving them almost all his stake in the company but keeping around 5% to still earn something passively, while accepting not just a considerable sum of money, but also a small stake in his contact's main business, an insignificant 1 or 2%. However, with the sum that would be a little more than his original investment into the company, Max had then gone and invested in another potential company and repeated the process. Unfortunately, he was also not a god, so he ended up failing, but that was only once, and he knew the risk so had only invested around £500. But this had pushed back his plan of returning the bank loan by half a year. Ultimately, Max had 5% stakes in around 15 new and growing companies, and around a 1 to 2% stake in another 15 already established and mature companies of his friends that he had made with the help of Mr. Terrence, ultimately resulting in his earning £300 of profit just from the businesses where he has to do nothing other than give some advice every now and then. The friends he had made were not limited by age or gender, and most definitely not limited to any political faction. In fact, he had made his stance very clear. Just like his ownership in his businesses, he did not care much about the rulers of Backland or Leon. He did not want to get involved, and would not join or support either of the factions who were involved in the considerably fierce political battle for power of the capital city and the country as a whole. He had said that he just wanted to enjoy life and did not wish to get involved in the politics of Backland. He had extensively promised not to give either side any support of preferential treatment and done so specifically in front of people of the other factions to make his stance clear. Me, I am just an investor. I invest in companies when they are small, and pull out once someone with sufficient financial and entrepreneurial backing comes along, making a small profit along the way from my risks. This was what he maintained for over a year, and his contacts had slowly understood this and kept him out of their political talks. In fact, Max only spoke to all his contacts he had made thanks to Mr. Terrence for either business and investment or for fun. Though the number of people he spoke to for the latter was considerably fewer than the former. Most of the rich merchants and lower nobility understood Max's ability in recognizing potential starlets, while also being able to help them reach that point. However, due to the fact that Max did not want to participate in politics, which had become what the nobility and rich merchants mainly did other than partying, Max was never pulled into their close circles, and he was perfectly fine with that arrangement. Well, that was pretty much all for his business side, other than the fact that he ended up employing a CEO for Dunnant's department store from one of the suggestions of Mrs. Hall, while Mrs. Dunnant agreed to become part of the human resources of the company that had grown to the point that it had 6 stores all over Backland, and another one planned. However, for this, it had also been holding back 20% of the pure profits for reinvestment without having to dilute the shares of the current owners any further. Unfortunately, Mac had not made much growth in the aspect of hiring Beyonders, mainly for the reason that he did not wish for the official Beyonder organization breathing down his neck once they found out who he was. As not just YCT, what Max had been able to find was something very important to him. He had been able to find all the ingredients for his potion, all of which were currently safely stored in his suitcase, which he had resting on his lap. In fact, Max had found sufficient materials for 2 such potions and had kept the second batch at his rented home as a precaution in case something happened to this first batch before the time he could make use of it. Naturally, Max had split up the ingredients and placed them in all corners of his house separately. I am not some wannabe assassin who cannot take the necessary precautions. Max smiled as he patted the suitcase and returned to observing the passing scenery and retreating gray-green fog. As the train moved away from Backland, the air gradually cleared up and nature began to return. Other than the money and Beyonder ingredients, Max had also achieved 2 important things over the period of nearly 10 months. The first was that he had successfully learned Hermes, and Ancient Hermes to a considerable degree. Learning these 2 languages was no joke, especially Ancient Hermes. Klein coming with the language preset into his mind now made sense to Max, else the first 2 volumes of the novel would have just revolved around him attending different classes to learn the language. Max had taken almost 7 months of learning every day for him to become sufficiently fluent in these languages, and the process was anything but interesting. As for the second thing he had accomplished, it was that he was finally able to create items which had a trace of the amalgamation of all within them, just like the mirror that Ms. Justice, Audrey Hall had that contained a trace of the Saphira Castle, which had allowed Klein to pull her to the castle. Max had created these items by sacrificing them to himself, injecting a faint amount of the black mist into it, before sacrificing it back. Max had not found a more efficient method of doing this. However, since he had brought them up, he had ensured to instill a small amount of anti-divination into the objects, just long enough for their origin and that Max was the first to handle them to be hidden from anyone who tried to search them. With this method, Max spread these items by throwing some into the nearby river, while also throwing some in the garbage, and finally slipping some into the bags and pants of other people. These items range from simple pens to extravagant silver pendants, to appeal to many ranges of people. Ultimately, Max hoped for it to activate the law of Beyonder characteristic convergence and have a Beyonder activate the item. This was with the hopes of creating a similar organization to Klein's Tarot Club. Anyways, right now he was heading towards Tingen for a single reason, to meet Klein and rescue an acquaintance or 2 if possible. Over this period of time, Max had understood one thing. Only those of the White Tower, Hermit, and Paragon pathways could see that he was actually a Beyonder. No other Beyonder could actually recognize this just by looking at him, and would only see a normal human until he utilized his powers. He had also exposed himself to great risk by going to St. Samuel Cathedral, the Evernight goddess headquarters, as well as exposing himself to many of the Beyonders from the psychology alchemists, all resulting in no reaction. Although this did not mean that he would be invisible to a certain goddess and a certain reincarnated perfectionist, Max was sure that he would, at least, not stand out to them like other Beyonders. This was why he was taking the risk of coming here and the risk of meeting Klein. He was confident in the inability of the already preoccupied goddess and angel to find and locate him too easily. More importantly, his very existence would have changed the original timeline to an extent, especially considering he had done a lot in Backland, which could affect things across Leon. Thus, he would have to help Klein become the Lord of Mysteries unless he wanted to remain a Singularity forever, and never actually advance to Unity. After all, becoming Unity meant he needed samples of each of the Sephiroths, including the ones sealed away by the original Lord of Mysteries in the Western continent. Well then, time to throw myself into the plot of the novel, and see what happens. Max mused as his mouth twitched at the rather absurd effects his involvement would have on the future trajectory of the plot. Returning to Tingen, it was still June 27th, the day Klein kills himself, along with Welch and Naya, if Max remembered the names correctly. The latter two were rather forgettable characters to Max, despite being rather closely involved in the entire conspiracy of Volume 1. Max alighted the steam locomotive and stepped onto the platform, breathing in the much fresher air of Tingen, the city of universities. Without much thought, Max continued to walk as memories passed in his mind. He remembered the scene of his parents being killed and his capture into slavery. He remembered his death, coinciding with the death of Samuel, before their souls merged into his body and his miraculous revival. He remembered sneaking into the city and hoodwinking an old man into taking him in. He remembered the few weeks he had spent with the old man, how he had taken care of him like his own grandson. He recalled how he felt when he realized the old man was leaving. Who was I kidding? I didn't want him to leave, not because my survival chances reduced, but because I just did not want him to leave. Max thought to himself as he realized that he was indeed a lot more emotional than he had previously thought he was. It was just that he used his rational mind to make excuses that justified his emotional reactions. This was especially the case when he left the many pounds in the safe, and how he had helped the old man with all he could think of, and even went to the extent of finding the knowledge magisters and telling them of the situation with their leader and his old man. He could have easily gone to Backland and then found the item, but instead he took the risk to reaching out to them. Not because it was the best or safest course of action, but because he hoped that they would be able to find their leader, and by extension, his old man. Without realizing it, Max had reached the Entwine Café. Its lights were out despite it being near the evening, the point in time where the rush of people just getting out of their jobs would appear and cause a huge flood of customers. In fact, Max noticed that there was a considerable amount of dust and dirt collecting around the windows and door of the café. Through the dirty window, Max could also see a considerable pile of letters. Clip-clop, pedestrians and carriages passed by Max as he was lost in memory for a while. Soon, however, his will became resolute as he nodded to himself and turned around, and began walking with purpose. However, on the way, he felt as though he was being watched, and his spirituality was also telling him that someone was watching him. Not a moment of concentration later, Max could not hear a faint set of footsteps, deliberately set to match his own, as the person moved closer and closer to Max from behind. Holding his very important brick F case in his left hand, Max reached into his overcoat pocket with his right, and grabbed one of the few bullets he had taken from Backland, before grasping it tightly in his hand. Carefully he pulled it out and acted as though he was just casually appreciating the warm summer weather of Tingen. After finally, Max found a rather secluded alley, one which allowed the building next to him to cover a portion of it in complete darkness. One thing Max had observed from the novel was that things like divination only portrayed a particular image, and in many cases, this image only involved what was visible to the naked eye. As such, if he and his face was hidden under darkness or a mask, it was much harder for an enemy diviner to find him. Suddenly, Max pivoted on his left foot and dashed into the alley to his right that he had just scouted out, leaping swiftly into the darkness, and keeping his palm open facing the entrance of the alley. The bullet lay levitating at its center, also facing the entrance. Max's control over his powers had grown significantly, but he had yet to actually understand what his acting method could be. A bender was not exactly an occupation like seer or hunter that were easy to understand. The footsteps grew closer, however, they did not increase in speed as Max had thought they would, which irked him even more. A calm opponent was definitely more dangerous than an angered or flustered one. Soon enough, Max saw the silhouette of the person who had been following him. He shot out the bullet with his full power without hesitation. Although there was no noise resembling that of a gun, the attack power behind it was just that, making this attack even more deadly than a traditional gun. However, the bullet just passed through the person as though he did not exist, but he was clearly right there. The person did not stop walking and Max began to internally panic, however he did not show any of it. He knew one thing, the person in front of his was a Beander, and at the very eye-cast a mid-sequence one. Max let go of his bag for the first time. While his right hand reached into his right pocket for another bullet and pulled it out for an attack, his left hand reached into his other pocket and pulled out a crystal monocle. This action had a visible effect on the person, making Max curse under his breath. The only people who were scared of this monocle were high-sequence Beyonders. In fact, only angels and kings of angels were actually afraid of this, ultimately resulting in only one suspect that was following him. As though to clear his suspicions, the person restarted his walking and finally walked into the light for him to see. It was a young man in stature, but a mature adult from his face. He wore a simple white cloak, with golden hair and a beard. He wore a silver cross on his neck, just like any ordinary priest. His pure and innocent eyes were like that of a child, but when they scanned Max, various emotions rushed past them faster than Max could even notice. It was none other than the angel of imagination, Adam. As it turned out, Max's foolproof plan was actually full of holes. He had not tested out his theory of only the White Tower, Paragon, and Hermit pathways being able to see his Beyonder status. In fact, he had tested it against the Paragon and Hermit pathways to begin with, and just assumed so based on the few people he had interacted with without any proof or scientific deduction. What the hell was I thinking coming here? Max thought to himself before throwing the thoughts out of his mind. He needed to follow one of his various plans to get out of this situation. After thinking for a while, Max decided to try and test his luck. His theory had not been proven false thus far, despite Adam appearing in front of him. It could have been just him being curious, nothing much. But that was bad and he had to get out of the current situation. Thankfully, despite the idiotic decision to come here so early, Max had thought of countless scenarios, and one of them was being confronted by Adam alone. "What do you want?" he said, pulling the monocle closer to his eyes with every second. It was definitely not enough to scare Adam away, but it was most definitely enough to put pressure on his decision-making skills. "You are an anomaly, someone who should not be, yet somehow are." "Who are you?" "Max. You can call me Max." Max knew that with his extensive powers and the Hermit Order behind him, Adam would easily find out who he was, so there was no point in hiding it. "What are you?" Adam said as he kept stepping closer and closer, while Max pulled the monocle closer and closer. "I am me, the one and only. However, what you should be asking is what I know," Max said while a slight grin appeared on his face. One of his prediction of Adam being unable to Professor X-style mind rape him was teetering on the edge of being true, and so he decided to take a leap of faith. If it turned out to be false, then he would lose nothing other than angering a rather rational irrational mythical king of angels. Well, I guess there is a lot to lose. Max rebuked himself for utilizing the worst plan of all his plans. This one did indeed end with him gaining the most benefits, but failure of this plan likely would mean his immediate death, and he did not know if the amalgamation of all could revive him like the Saphira Castle revived Klein. But Samuel seemed to be determined to go down this path. Now that he had already said what was said, he could not back down. On the bright side, if he was successful, he would stand to gain a lot, including being alive. "What do you know, Max?" the blonde-haired man said as he stopped moving forward, causing Max's hand to also stop just short of fully placing it on his cheek. "The Lord that created everything," Max began, causing a visible reaction to the normally unchanging face of the angel of imagination. "The omnipotent and omniscient God." "Stop. How much do you know?" "Enough. I do not wish to come in your way, and as such, I do not wish to call him to intervene in this conflict, as it will only harm me. Similarly, I do not wish to be part of your play, for a lack of better words. I will not intervene in your schemes, son, but in return, you must not drag me into your mess thither. The quill has been handled and will not involve me. What I want is for you to ignore my existence. Are you willing to do that?" Max had not lied a single time. It was true he did not wish to interfere with Adam's plans, and in fact, he would likely end up helping him along the way to an extent. This fact should have been picked up by the angel by now and he should be rapidly thinking about solutions. Before you think killing me will do anything, let it be known that not even a true god can kill me at the moment." Again, he had not lied. A certain outer god would definitely throw a tantrum and attack the already weakening barrier of Earth, and if a true god tried to descend to kill him, she would most definitely force them back to the spirit world to protect the barrier. This caused many changes to Adam's initial plan, as he could see the truth in Max's words, despite not understanding how even a true god would be unable to kill him. Still, the mere fact that Mac could use Beyonder powers, but to Adam he looked just like a normal human, had lots of implications. Together with the fact that Max knew about his true identity, as well as Amon's, and yet was unwilling to bring him here meant that he understood what Amon could do. Sickerly, he knew a lot, and someone who knew so much should logically not be human anymore. After all, knowledge is both a power and a curse. Yet, here was Max, a normal human with Beyonder powers. Max had shown that he had Beyonder powers by launching the bullet at a speed similar to that of a gun, without actually having a gun. Now this could be the effect of a sealed item with Beyonder characteristics, but Adam could not sense such a thing. This could only mean that unless Ammonises directly interfered with his perception, no other Beyonder item should be around Max, other than that little sword of his that was carefully positioned on his back to hide it from others. Adam was actually confused as to what exactly Max was, and this was the first time he was encountering something like this. It was almost like Eamon was toying with his perception. The thought immediately caused him to become more alert and he sensed his surroundings, before closing his eyes and letting out a burst of energy to dispel all irregularities. Yet, nothing changed. "What is your pathway?" he asked, still unsure as to who or what Max was. Was he the incarnation of some unknown great old one who had just resurfaced? "My pathway is not one of the 22. Neither is it one of the countless of the cosmos. It is one from beyond, and I am the only," Max said, restricting his words to keep them as vague as possible while giving Adam a taste of his own medicine. One thing he hated more than the very existence of Eamon was the cryptic way of talking employed by his brother, Adam. Samuel might hate Eamon, but in reality, we all love our little heir. He was, is, and will always be the best good boy, no homo. Adam was at a loss. This Max knew so much, that he should have turned into some random mythical creature by now just from knowing it all, or one of the outer gods should have thrown a fit for using the countless pathways and cosmos in his speech. Yet here he was, completely unharmed. This was something only kings of angels and gods could do, and that too only due to the support of the barrier from the true creator. But there would definitely be backlash from the great old ones occupying the solar system when mentioning them unless you were concealed. Adam stood still for a moment before vanishing from Max's point of view. The next moment, Max felt his vision go dark as he caught a glimpse of Adam staring into his eyes. The last thing he heard was a rather sadistic voice, "Let me see." Deal and Klein. Max opened his eyes in a white space. There was nothing in front of him and nothing behind. Suddenly, a figure in priest robes appeared in front of him as though he had been standing there the whole time. Adam, Max though, but his voice surprisingly echoed all around him, and Adam smiled as though trying to soothe someone, but it only seemed more sadistic to Max. Max also realized where they were, inside his mind. Perhaps if he were to find a way to leave the inside of his mind, he would find himself in the ocean of collective conscience where Mr. Justice would venture to one day. But first, Max needed to get Adam out of his mind. Max quickly called upon the amalgamation of all, and utterly destroyed the white illusion using the black solidifying tar from the Sephiroth. Instead of using the weak mist that he had used only a wisp of to instill the scent of the Sephiroth in the items he created a while ago, this time Max used a handful of the almost solidified tar, which was denser than the liquid. Quite literally, Max used overwhelming power to make Adam leave his mind. Naturally, this was only possible since it was inside his own mind, where his soul resided. This was impossible to do in the real world, as Adam would just utterly crush him. Back in the real world, Max regained his senses and saw Adam looking at him with a bewildered gaze. Max decided to egg the madam onto returning to his goals. "You can keep trying to invade my mind, and I can keep removing you for as long as it takes. But by then, your story will alter beyond your ability to fix it. So, how does my initial offer sound to you now? We both just ignore each other as though we do not exist. In fact, let me tell you something. I will most likely end up helping you and a certain goddess in your goals, since my goal is also the same. Though I may be different to you all, our goals are still the same." "Why fight?" Max said, a smile on his face as he continued, "or do you wish for us to continue this charade? Should I call him? I'm sure you would not like that. I bet even she would not like his interference. Plus, he will throw all your plans into chaos. Why bother trying to destroy and rebuild what is not broken? Especially when what you think is a crack is actually just a repairman, trying to prevent cracks from occurring due to its own existence." Max had essentially thrown out most of his cards, and he was hoping one of them was enough to persuade Adam into leaving him alone. In fact, if he could get Adam's permission to stick around in Tingen, it would be even better as he would no longer have to worry about being discovered by one of the most powerful beings still able to live on Earth, considering the true gods of Sequence O could not descend onto Earth unless special circumstances permit. Max held his breath while Adam contemplated. Meanwhile, a concealed goddess and not so concealed great old on that covered the moon, turning it red, had their attention placed on this conversation. Max knew that the mother goddess was observing him from the amalgamation of all, while he had a feeling that the goddess of Evernight was also looking at him, since she had almost all her focus here, in Tingen. In fact, from what Max vaguely recalled about the latter parts of the novel, multiple gods worked together to rid Klein of the original Lord of Mysteries, will, as well as dispose of the tainted Beander characteristics ranging from Sequence 9 all the way to Sequence 0 of the Fool's Pathway, that had been sealed into the Saphira Castle to make it easier for the will of the Lord of Mysteries to take over Klein's body and ascend to Great Old On quickly. Thus, as long as Adam agreed, and no natural disaster occurred in the immediate vicinity, Max would have gotten the tacit approval of a few true gods as well as a rather active king of angels. "Why are you so sure?" Adam said before Max's vision turned dark once more. But this time, he was already connected to the amalgamation of all, so it did not even take an instant for his mindscape where Adam had invaded to shatter into nothingness once more, returning both their minds to the real world. "You have a Sephiroth, not one of the originals, but a Sephiroth nonetheless." After a while, Adam just nodded slightly before vanishing from Max's view. Well, that was one way to handle it, Max thought to himself as he realized Samuel's gamble this time around had actually paid off. He now no longer needed to be afraid of being smitten into oblivion from the heavens, or chased down by a rapid king of angels while in Tingen. The only thing he needed to be careful of was the normal Beyonders in Tingen, though this was much more manageable. "My bullets," Max exclaimed as he rushed out of the alley and began searching the cobbled ground for the 3 bullets he had fired at the King of Angels. Although it would be hard for someone to find him from just the bullets, if official Beyonders got involved, especially those with divination or tracking abilities, his stay in Tingen would really be cut short by one single incident. As he picked up the bullets from the grounds and stone wall to the other side of the alley, Max thought about one fact. "I do not have anything that is actually useful against mid and high sequence Beyonders. I had not approached the Beyonder gatherings of Backlund for fear of being investigated by the official Beyonders who keep an eye on every gathering to look out for individuals like me, and possibly being reported to a true god. Well, now this matter is no longer of concern. I should go visit the underground black market of Tingen to take up some Beyonder items." What was the name of the kid again? From the black market. Ah yes, Monster. Maybe I could even recruit him to my organization. Max had a wonderful idea and decided to act on it at once. Although he had come here to search for the old man, the only possible lead he had was the Knowledge Magisters, whose location he did not know. As such, searching for their whereabouts in the black market of Tingen was also one of his goals. Max began to walk down the street as the ball of fiery death gradually set in the horizon and Tingen welcomed the reassuring red glow of the moon. June 28, 1349 of the 5th epoch. As midnight passed and Max was busy exploring the black market without actually buying anything, another very significant event was occurring in Tingen. Klein Moretti had killed himself after returning home almost in a daze, while Zhou Mingrui, the college student from China, had taken his place in a twist of fate. However, in reality, it was all a well-thought-out plan by the original Lord of Mysteries, who was often called the Celestial Worthy. Thankfully, Evernight and a few other gods had been present to prevent Klein from turning into the body of the Celestial Worthy and instead allowed Klein to organically grow into a new Lord of Mysteries. As Max shuffled through the dark streets of the underground market, Zhou Mingrui found himself in an unfamiliar room with a throbbing headache as memories of Klein fused into his own, resulting in him turning into Klein as well. Zhou Mingrui struggled to open his eyes, only to faintly see the crimson moon in the sky, while a throbbing pain continued to persist in his head. Turning his eyes, he saw a desk with an open book with yellow pages on it, next to a stack of neatly piled books numbering 8. The walls had pipes connected to lamps that were about half the size of a human head but were currently off. The only source of light was the red glow from the crimson moon. Next to the notebook, Zhou Mingrui found a revolver, something he was accustomed to only seeing in movies and comics. Instantly he began to panic. The pain pulsing in his head, the darkness only mitigated by a dull crimson glow, a revolver, and the unstable control over his own body caused Joe to rapidly dart his eyes and observe the surroundings as his breathing quickened. Soon enough, he spotted a mirror and noticed that he was no longer himself. He had black hair, and brown eyes, and was wearing a linen shirt. He had rather average-looking features and was not particularly well built. After another moment of panic, Joe began to calm himself, right before he received a flood of information in the form of memories. These were the memories of Klein Moretti, a citizen of the northern continent's Leon Kingdom, currently living in the city of Tingen. Klein was a graduate of the Department of History at Koya University, which was only possible due to the private education he had received from the bereavement allowance of his sergeant father's sacrifice in a colonial conflict. Klein was currently an orphan as his mother also passed away in the same year he had passed the entrance examination for the university. Together with his elder brother and younger sister, they lived in a two-bedroom apartment. Many memories rushed through Klein's mind as the souls of Joe Mingrui and Klein combined and fully fused. However, compared with the perfect fusion between Max and Samuel, where the two were one while still being aware of the existence of the other half, Klein and Joe were not so perfectly fused. Instead, most of the mind was occupied by Joe, while only a small portion was taken up by Klein, only in the form of memories and his love for his family. Klein proceeded to follow through with the exact same process as he did in the original novel, with no change at all. If Max was here, he would indeed find this a little odd, since his mere existence should have changed the future, at least by a little. However, all of this would soon change. Klein finally noticed the bullet wound in his skull, and took a while to process it, realizing that his transmigration had allowed him to recover from this deadly wound. After a while of contemplation, something he did rather often, he recalled his luck enhancement ritual that he assumed had brought him here and decided to place all his bets on this and try it OUL. For more thrilling fanfiction stories like this, check out my channel Fanfic audiobook. Dive into epic adventures, mysterious realms, and legendary journeys brought to life through immersive storytelling. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more amazing audiobooks.